Section 1. The Boy Who Drew Everything. There is a town in northwestern Connecticut called Kent. It sits in Litchfield County, surrounded by low green hills that roll and soften in every direction, the kind of landscape that feels deliberately quiet, as if the land itself decided long ago to keep its voice down. The Housatonic River moves through the valley nearby, slow and brown in late summer, and the whole place has the feeling of somewhere time agreed to move a little more gently than it does everywhere else. The population is small, and has always been small. The Kent School, a co-educational boarding school founded in 1906, defines the intellectual identity of the town in a way that very few single institutions define anything. The hills hold their shapes through every season, patient and unmoved by whatever is happening in the rest of the world. This is where Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was born on the 26th of October, 1973. His father, Ronald, was a prep school teacher, specifically a teacher at the Kent School, the institution that defined the town's intellectual life. His mother, Anne, worked as an admissions administrator at the same school. His sister, Rachel, would go on to become a voice actress and singer in her own right, eventually contributing her talents to animated projects including Family Guy itself. From the outside, it sounded like a quiet, bookish New England household, and in many ways it was. There were books everywhere, teachers in the family. The particular intellectual seriousness that comes from living in an educational environment where being curious and being articulate were simply treated as basic requirements of adult functioning. But inside that house, from almost the very beginning, there was a child who could not stop drawing. He was sketching Woody Woodpecker and Fred Flintstone at the age of 2. This is not an exaggeration for dramatic effect, it is the biographical record. Not copying them in the blurry, imprecise way that toddlers usually replicate things they love, but actually drawing them with attention to shape and proportion, already developing the habit of close observation that would define his career. By the time he was old enough to ask organized questions about the world, the questions he asked were specifically about how animation worked. Not how airplanes flew or where rain came from, but how a drawing could be made to move. How a series of still images could create the impression of continuous motion. How the gap between images, the darkness between frames, could be crossed by the viewer's own perception so completely that the viewer never noticed the crossing. He was already thinking like a filmmaker and a technician simultaneously before he had reached kindergarten. He was sketching Woody Woodpecker and Fred Flintstone at the age of 2, not copying them in the blurry, approximate way that small children usually try to replicate things they love, actually drawing them, studying the shapes, figuring out where the lines went. By the time he was old enough to ask questions about the world, the questions he asked were about how animation worked. Not how airplanes flew or how stars were formed, but how a drawing could be made to move, how an image could give the impression of life. He was already thinking like a filmmaker before he had ever seen the inside of a classroom. His parents bought him an 8mm movie camera when he was still a child, and he used it to make his first short films, small science fiction stories, little experiments in motion and story. He was not just playing with a toy. He was beginning to practice a craft he had already decided he was going to spend his life pursuing. By the time he was 14 years old, he watched his first episode of The Simpsons on television, and something inside him shifted. He had grown up planning to work for Disney. Disney was the institution, the dream, the gold standard of American animation. But watching The Simpsons, he understood for the first time that animation could be something else. It could be sharp. It could be for grown-ups. It could carry ideas that a Disney film would never touch. He adjusted his plans. He graduated from Kent School in 1991 and enrolled at the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence. The school is known informally as RISD, pronounced like the word Rizzy, without the second syllable, just RISD, and it carries a reputation as one of the finest art and design institutions in the country. MacFarlane studied animation there, and by all accounts he was an unusual student. He performed stand-up comedy in his spare time. He made student films. He met a fellow student named Mike Henry, whose brother Patrick was in MacFarlane's class, and Mike Henry would eventually become part of the Family Guy cast. The connections were already forming before any of them knew what they would one day be connected to. In his senior year, MacFarlane sat down and produced his thesis film. He called it The Life of Larry. It was a short animated piece about a hapless, heavyset, dim-witted, middle-aged man named Larry Cummings, his patient wife, his overweight teenage son, and his cynical talking dog named Steve. If you watch it today, which you can find online without much effort, the genetic resemblance to what would become Family Guy is unmistakable. Larry moves and sounds like a rougher, scratchier version of Peter Griffin. Steve is the clear ancestor of Brian Griffin, thoughtful, sardonic, the one character in the room who seems to understand what everyone around him is missing. The animation is undergraduate work, undeniably, but the voice and the instinct behind it are already present. Something alive is in there, waiting to be developed. A professor at RISD saw the film and, recognizing what it contained, submitted it to Hanna-Barbera Productions, the legendary studio in West Hollywood that had given the world Yogi Bear, The Flintstones, Scooby-Doo, and dozens of other foundational cartoon properties. The timing was significant. Hanna-Barbera was in the process of reinventing itself as Cartoon Network Studios, seeking fresh, creative voices for a new era of animation. Ellen Cockrell, the studio's head of development, attended the senior screening at RISD and watched McFarlane's film. She offered him a position on the spot. McFarlane graduated in 1995 with a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree. He packed up and moved to Los Angeles to begin his career, and he was 21 years old. At Hanna-Barbera, he worked as an animator and writer across several of the studio's productions. He contributed to Dexter's Laboratory, Cow and Chicken, and most extensively to Johnny Bravo, where the show's script writing process gave him the room to develop his own voice in a way the other projects had not. He also did freelance work for Walt Disney Television Animation, writing for a series called Jungle Cubs, and wrote for the animated Ace Ventura, pet detective series at Nelvana. He was learning the industrial mechanics of animation, how a writer's room functioned, how a script moved from idea to storyboard to finished frame, how timing and expression and movement all worked together to make something land or fall flat. During this time, he made a second short film. He called it Larry and Steve, and it was a retool of The Life of Larry. In this new version, the relationship between Larry and his dog was sharpened. They were still an odd couple, still a bumbling man and a brilliant animal, but the dynamic between them was more developed. Larry adopts Steve from the dog pound, after noticing that Steve is the only talking dog there. Though, of course, to everyone else in the cartoon, Steve just barks, the same way Stewie would later communicate in a manner that only certain characters could understand. It aired in 1997 on Cartoon Network as part of their world premiere Toons programming block. Executives at the Fox Broadcasting Company saw it. This is the moment. This is the specific, precise inflection point where everything changed. Fox had been trying to get back into the primetime animation business. The Simpsons was proving that the format worked, that audiences would show up for adult-oriented animated comedy in the evenings, that the genre was more than Saturday morning children's entertainment. They wanted more of it. A development executive at Hanna-Barbera introduced McFarlane to Leslie Collins and Mike Darnell, who ran Fox's alternative comedy department. Negotiations began. McFarlane was offered a deal to develop a series based on his Larry and Steve characters. He spent 6 months by his own account, barely sleeping, drawing almost constantly in his kitchen, building the pilot. He later described the process to the New York Times as a period of no sleep and no life, just drawing like crazy and pushing himself through it. The characters were reimagined. Larry became Peter Griffin. Steve became Brian. New members were added to the family: a wife, a teenage daughter, an awkward son, and a baby. The baby, in the early conception of the show, was going to be the source of the show's most original and surreal energy. Fox signed McFarlane to a contract worth approximately $2.5 million per year. The show was called Family Guy. He was 24 years old. He had a network deal and a production budget and a year of his life already poured into this thing, and he was going to voice most of it himself. The voice of Peter Griffin came directly from McFarlane's own experiences at RISD. There was a security guard who worked on or near the campus, a big, loud, opinionated man whose voice McFarlane found himself listening to with a kind of involuntary fascination. The security guard, whose name was later reported to be Butch Timmons, was apparently exactly what Peter Griffin ended up being: heavy-set, boisterous, full of opinions expressed at high volume, possessed of a specific kind of working-class New England confidence that did not require the approval of anyone more formally educated. Timmons later told a news organization that he was aware of his connection to the character and that he was proud of it. He said that Seth was a brilliant student and that they used to chat during Timmons's smoke breaks. The voice that emerged from those conversations, combined with MacFarlane's musical training and comedic instincts, became one of the most recognizable voices in American television. The voice of Brian was something closer to MacFarlane's natural speaking register, measured, dry, a little world-weary, possessed of the kind of ironic detachment that serves as both a coping mechanism and a form of intelligence. Brian's voice does not call attention to itself. It is not a cartoon voice in any conventional sense. It is closer to the voice of a thoughtful man in his 40s who has read a great deal and experienced moderate disappointment and is managing both with relative grace. This normalcy was the point. Brian needed to be the character who grounded the show's absurdism by reacting to it the way a reasonable person would react, and his voice needed to carry that quality of slightly surprised sanity. Stewie's voice was something MacFarlane had been developing for considerably longer than the show itself. He had received formal voice training from an elderly couple whose earlier students had included Frank Sinatra, himself a lineage so unexpected that it sounds like something a Family Guy writer would invent as a throwaway gag, but that appears to be biographical fact. The training gave MacFarlane a technical foundation for his vocal performances that is audible in the specific quality of Stewie's articulation. The voice is not simply a British accent. It is a character voice built with genuine technique, consistent across different emotional registers, capable of moving from menace to despair to triumph to petulance within the same monologue without losing its essential identity, sustainable for hours of recording sessions without the kind of vocal fatigue that destroys less well-constructed character voices. And then there was Quagmire. Glenn Quagmire, the Griffin family's neighbor and one of Peter's closest friends, was built on a voice energy that was entirely its own thing. The specific lounge lizard effect MacFarlane created for him, nasal but smooth, rhythmically confident, redolent of cologne and self-assurance, captured a very specific cultural type, with the precision of good caricature. It was not just funny as a voice. It was accurate as a portrait. Every word Glenn Quagmire spoke suggested a man who had assembled a complete personal mythology out of mid-century swinger culture and was living inside that mythology with complete sincerity and no apparent awareness that the mythology had a shelf life. The voice was a performance of a worldview. 4 main characters, all coming from one person, all needing to be immediately and unmistakably distinguishable from one another, all needing to feel inhabited rather than performed. This was a technically demanding achievement that is easy to take for granted because MacFarlane made it sound effortless. But the discipline required to sustain 4 distinct character states in rapid succession, sometimes transitioning between them within the same scene, as in moments where characters impersonated each other or a single recording session covered scenes from multiple character perspectives, was real. MacFarlane managed it by treating each voice not as a vocal register he was producing, but as a psychological state he was entering. Peter was the loud, instinctive id. Brian was the thoughtful, restrained ego managing the id's consequences. Stewie was the id again, but filtered through extraordinary sophistication and completely inverted development. Quagmire was something else entirely, a parody of a kind of man, a specific cultural type, compressed into a cartoon neighbor with enough consistency that the parody itself became a character. Before the series had even aired, though, there was one more casting story that deserves telling, because it nearly went very differently. The role of Meg Griffin, the Griffin family's teenage daughter, went through 3 actresses before it found its home. The first was Cree Summer, a well-known voice actress best remembered as the voice of Elmyra on Tiny Toon Adventures. Summer was actually hired to voice Meg for the pilot presentation, but was let go by producers before she recorded a single line. The second was Lacey Chabert, then well known for her role on Party of 5, who voiced Meg through the first season of the show. Chabert later explained that she left the role of her own accord because she was in school, and the demands of Party of 5 were already filling her schedule. When the second season arrived, a 15-year-old actress from Ukraine named Mila Kunis auditioned for the part. She went in, sat down, and essentially did not do a voice at all. She just spoke in her own natural voice. The only note MacFarlane gave her in the room was to slow down. She got the part. She has voiced Meg Griffin ever since, through hundreds of episodes, across more than 2 decades, watching the character she plays transform in ways that she has spoken about publicly with complicated affection. Alex Borstein, who would voice Lois Griffin, came to the show through a different but equally fortunate accident of timing. She was working on Mad TV, the sketch comedy show that had originally been intended back before the budget fell apart as the home for Family Guy itself. MacFarlane had planned for Family Guy to begin as animated shorts embedded in Mad TV episodes, similar to the way The Simpsons had begun as interstitials on The Tracey Ullman Show. But Mad TV simply did not have the production budget to support animation, and so the idea was abandoned and the show went directly to Fox as a standalone program. Borstein was therefore already in MacFarlane's orbit when she walked into the recording booth for the pilot presentation. She had based Lois's voice on a cousin from Long Island, slower and lower than the version that would eventually air. When she played it back for MacFarlane, his response was characteristically direct. He told her to make it a little less annoying and speed it up, and then added that otherwise every episode would run 4 hours. The network later tried to have Borstein replaced when the show moved from pilot to full series. She fought to keep her job, re-auditioned against, as she put it, every female who had ever stepped off a bus in Hollywood, and won. Seth Green, who would voice Chris Griffin, did something memorable in his audition. He performed an impression of Buffalo Bill, the disturbing villain from The Silence of the Lambs, and then imagined what that voice would sound like if it were speaking through a public address system at a McDonald's. That combination horror movie menace filtered through fast food intercom reverb became the voice of the Griffin family's awkward teenage son. It is one of those creative decisions that makes no intuitive sense until you hear it, and then sounds perfectly obvious. The show went into full production. The pilot was titled Death Has a Shadow. It was ready to air. Fox scheduled it for a specific date in January of 1999, and the date they chose was not accidental. They were going to put Family Guy right after the Super Bowl. Drop a comment down below and let me know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing where these videos reach, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It keeps this whole operation going, and it means everything. Section 2. The Super Bowl slot and the show that almost wasn't. Super Bowl 33 took place on January 31st, 1999, at Pro Player Stadium in Miami, Florida. The Denver Broncos defeated the Atlanta Falcons by a score of 34-19. Roughly 83 million people watched the game. And when the final whistle blew and the network needed something to fill the slot immediately after, they had Family Guy waiting. 22 million people stayed on the channel. 22 million. For a brand new animated series about a fictional Rhode Island family, created by a 25-year-old who had spent 6 months drawing it in his kitchen and was now voicing 4 of its main characters, that was a number that redefined the stakes overnight. The show had not even aired a regular weekly episode yet, and it had already been seen by more people than most programs accumulate across an entire season. The first episode those 22 million viewers watched established the show's world with a kind of confident, slightly reckless energy that is hard to recreate. Peter Griffin, the overweight father of the family, gets himself fired from his job at the happy-go-lucky toy factory after telling his boss to go to hell in a social skills class. He then somehow becomes eligible to receive welfare checks, begins spending the money, and has to cover this up from his wife Lois when the government inevitably figures out what's happening. It was not, in retrospect, the most sophisticated plot the show would ever produce. But it introduced the characters with a directness that worked, and it planted the show's cutaway gag format, its willingness to break narrative logic for a quick laugh, right from the first few minutes. The regular weekly run of the show began in April of 1999. Fox gave it the prime Sunday night slot immediately following The Simpsons and before The X-Files. It was, as primetime real estate goes, about as valuable a stretch of schedule as a new show could hope for. In its first season, Family Guy averaged 12.8 million households per episode and ranked number 33 overall in the Nielsen ratings. For an animated comedy on a broadcast network in its freshman year, those were solidly good numbers. The show had found an audience, and the audience seemed to be responding well. But Fox was already restless. The network moved the show to Thursday nights at 9 o'clock for its second season. This put it directly opposite Frasier on NBC, which was in the thick of its own enormous success. The ratings dropped. Fox then moved it again to Tuesday nights, where it found itself going head-to-head with Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC, a phenomenon quiz show that was dominating every time slot it occupied during that period and was essentially unmovable as a ratings force. The ratings dropped further. Fox kept shuffling Family Guy around its schedule with little apparent strategy and even less warning to viewers, making it nearly impossible for an audience to find a consistent habit of watching it. There is something almost poignant about this particular period of the show's history, because the chaos that drove it off the air had almost nothing to do with the quality of the episodes being produced. The writing in those first 3 seasons was sharp and inventive. The characters were fresh and well-defined. The humor was doing something genuinely original, mixing razor-edged satire with absolute absurdism, with genuine warmth, in a ratio that the show would struggle to maintain in later years but had, in those early seasons, gotten almost exactly right. Peter Griffin was a character worth spending time with. This is the essential point that gets lost when people talk about the early show versus the later show, so it deserves dwelling on. Peter was not smart. He made terrible decisions constantly, usually through a combination of impulsiveness and a profound inability to anticipate consequences. He drank too much beer at the Drunken Clam. He annoyed his neighbors and got into situations that no sensible person would have gotten into. He was, in almost every measurable way, a bad decision maker. But underneath all of that, clearly and consistently, he loved his family. He loved Lois. When an episode ended and things had gone wrong, Peter felt it. He apologized. He tried to make things right, clumsily and often ineffectively, but sincerely. That cycle of error, awareness, and attempted repair is the emotional machinery of almost every worthwhile family sitcom, and the early episodes of Family Guy ran that machinery well. Lois in those early seasons was not just the straight woman counterweight to Peter's chaos. She had her own interior life, her own sense of humor, her own willingness to occasionally do questionable things. She had been a piano student, came from a wealthy Rhode Island family she had essentially defied by marrying Peter, and carried a dry awareness of the absurdity of her situation. She was not a doormat. She was a woman who had chosen this life with open eyes, and was navigating it with as much grace as the situation permitted. Brian Griffin in those first 3 seasons was the show's moral compass, but wearing it lightly. He was well-read, genuinely intelligent, a little pretentious about his literary ambitions, and occasionally too fond of the martini glass that was almost always within reach. His friendship with Peter was the show's emotional backbone. These were 2 people who had almost nothing in common, and yet clearly needed each other. Peter needed someone to tell him when he was making things worse, and Brian needed someone who reminded him not to take himself so seriously. The dynamic was warm and funny, and felt like something that actually existed between actual people, which is a harder thing to achieve in animation than it sounds. And then there was Stewie. Stewie Griffin was, in those first 3 seasons, one of the most genuinely original characters in the history of American animated television. Let that sit for a moment. In a medium that had produced Homer Simpson, Bart Simpson, Bender Rodriguez, Eric Cartman, and dozens of other defining animated figures, Stewie was still something that had never been done before. He was a baby. He was 1 year old, still in diapers, still sitting in a high chair, still carried around by his parents and bathed by his mother. And he was also a genius of extraordinary scope who was building laser weapons in his bedroom, plotting global domination, and conducting a sustained, elaborate campaign to murder his own mother. The comedy engine of early Stewie was built on a specific and brilliant kind of dramatic irony. Lois had no idea. She would pick Stewie up and hold him against her shoulder and kiss his football-shaped head, and Stewie would stare over her shoulder with cold murder in his eyes, the same way a classic film villain might stare at the person who just announced they were taking him to dinner. Pleasant surface, lethal undercurrent. The audience knew what Stewie was thinking. Lois never did. And that gap between what we knew and what she believed was inexhaustible as a source of comedy because it could be replayed in an infinite variety of registers. Stewie could be menacing, despairing, triumphant, humiliated, brilliantly calculating, and catastrophically stupid all within the same episode, and every version of him worked because the core premise was rock solid. The writing room that produced these 3 seasons was assembled by McFarlane with deliberate care. The original staff included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. McFarlane was not just a figurehead in these early years, he was in the room, contributing, pitching, performing the voices in his head as he helped develop the jokes, so that the writing staff could hear exactly how a line would land before they committed it to paper. According to showrunner Alex Sulkin, having McFarlane in the writer's room during those early years was something close to a competitive advantage that no other show could buy. Not only was he the funniest writer in the room, but he could pitch a joke and simultaneously demonstrate its delivery in the exact voice the audience would eventually hear. It was, as Sulkin put it years later, like a cheat code. The production process for a single episode of Family Guy, even in those early years, was intensive. A rough sketch of the journey from idea to finished episode looks something like this. The writing staff gathered, pitched stories, broke them down, wrote outlines, then scripts, then went through multiple rounds of revision. Table reads with the voice cast let the room hear the material out loud, which always revealed things that looked fine on paper but died in performance, and also sometimes revealed things that looked unremarkable in script form, but came alive unexpectedly in a voice actor's hands. The scripts then went to storyboard artists, who created the visual plans for each scene. Those storyboards were the foundation on which the animators worked, and the animation itself went through its own series of review stages, animatic screenings, color screenings, timing adjustments before the episode was declared finished. By the time a finished episode reached a television screen, it had been in production for the better part of a year. The reason the show rarely dealt with immediate current events was precisely this. By the time an episode actually aired, whatever news moment had inspired it would likely be buried under a dozen subsequent news cycles. The animation for those first 2 seasons and the third was handled by Rough Draft Studios, whose work gave the show a particular quality that longtime fans remember fondly. The characters moved with a looseness that felt organic, a slight roughness that somehow communicated life. This was not polished or slick animation by any standard. The lines had a certain unevenness to them, the movements a slight imprecision, and these qualities, which might have looked like flaws to an outsider, actually contributed enormously to the show's comedic energy. Comedy in animation is partly about timing and partly about physicality, and the physicality of those early Family Guy characters was distinctively alive. When Peter fell down or ran or gesticulated wildly, the animation seemed to have a kind of genuine body weight to it, a sense that this character existed in a physical world with real momentum. That quality would change, and changed noticeably, after the revival. By the end of the 3rd season in 2002, Fox had made its decision. The ratings had never recovered from the scheduling misadventures of the earlier seasons. The show was canceled. The announcement came without much ceremony. After 3 seasons, 40 episodes, and enough creative foundation to build an entire universe of comedy on, Family Guy was being taken off the air. What nobody, not Fox, not McFarlane, not the writers, not the fans could have predicted was what would happen next. Section 3. The Resurrection: How a Cancelled Show Came Back from the Dead. Television history has a small and rather exclusive category for shows that were canceled and then brought back to life. The category exists mostly as a cautionary tale, because the standard outcome of cancellation is permanent. When a network decides it is done with a show, it moves on. The cast disperses, the writers find other work, and the particular creative ecosystem that made the show what it was dissolves. Occasionally a show gets a second chance on a different network. Rarely does it get one on the same network that canceled it. What happened to Family Guy was something that had essentially never happened before, and has only happened a small number of times since. The revival of Family Guy was built on 2 things: the Adult Swim block on Cartoon Network and the DVD. When Fox canceled the show, the rights to rerun the existing episodes became available. Cartoon Network acquired those rights for what was later described as a very low fee, almost nothing, in the accounting of television rights deals, because nobody believed the show was worth much anymore. The reruns premiered on Adult Swim on April 20th, 2003. The Adult Swim block had launched in 2001 as Cartoon Network's late-night programming aimed at adults, a block that was already developing a reputation for unusual, experimental, boundary-pushing animation. Shows like Aqua Teen Hunger Force, Robot Chicken, and The Venture Bros were finding audiences there that were hungry for exactly the kind of animation that broadcast television was reluctant to produce. Family Guy landed in that environment and immediately became the highest-rated show on the entire block. It dominated late-night viewing in its time slot against both cable and broadcast competition. In terms of raw audience numbers, it outperformed everything around it. More significantly, it boosted Adult Swim's overall viewership by 239%. A show that Fox had decided was not worth keeping on the air was now the most watched program on a competing network's late-night lineup. Simultaneously, the DVD release happened. The complete first and second seasons were released on DVD the same week that Family Guy premiered in reruns on Adult Swim. The set sold 400,000 copies within 1 month. 400,000. By the end of the calendar year, total sales of the first and second season sets had reached approximately 2.2 million copies. This made Family Guy DVDs the best-selling television DVDs of 2003. The only television release that had sold more copies at that point in history was the first season of Chappelle's Show on Comedy Central. People were not just passively watching the reruns on cable. They were buying the show and owning it and rewatching it, sharing it with friends, introducing new people to it. A cult was forming in the most literal sense of the word, a community of believers who had found something they loved and were actively working to spread it. The third season DVD release followed and also sold over 1 million copies. Fox noticed. Fox could not ignore this. A show they had canceled because it was not generating sufficient advertising revenue was now demonstrably generating enormous revenue in a different format on a competitor's network, building exactly the kind of dedicated, passionate, repeat engagement audience that advertisers pay premium rates to reach. MacFarlane later described the moment when Fox called him back in with characteristic precision. They said they wanted to, as he quoted them, sneak this thing back into production. On May 20th, 2004, Fox officially ordered 35 new episodes of Family Guy. The fourth season would premiere in 2005. It was the first time in television history that a show had been revived based primarily on DVD sales. MacFarlane's creation had come back from the dead through what was, at its heart, a demonstration of how much people actually valued what they had lost. The fan response was overwhelming. People who had been following the Adult Swim reruns and buying the DVDs and talking about the show online, this was the early days of internet fandom, of message boards and fan sites that could mobilize collective enthusiasm in ways that had not been possible a decade earlier, were jubilant. The show that had been canceled twice and written off as a failed experiment was returning. There were 4 seasons coming. MacFarlane was back, the Griffins were back, everything was going to be exactly as it had been. Except it was not going to be exactly as it had been, because it could not be. 3 years had passed. The writing staff had scattered to other jobs. The specific creative ecosystem of the original run, the combination of MacFarlane's hands-on involvement, those particular writers, that particular animating studio, all of that was gone. Rebuilding was possible. Exactly replicating it was not. When the 4th season premiered on May 1st, 2005, it was a major television event. Fox had constructed what it called Animation Domination on Sunday nights, a programming block that aligned Family Guy with The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and a new MacFarlane creation called American Dad that had premiered just months earlier in February. The return episode drew strong numbers and demonstrated unambiguously that the fan base built during the Adult Swim years was enormous and eager. But the show that came back was different in ways that were immediately perceptible to anyone who had watched the original 3 seasons closely. The animation was cleaner and more controlled, but somehow stiffer. The characters moved with less of the roughness that had made them feel alive. The cutaway gags, which had always been a part of the show's format but had operated as supplementary comic material rather than structural foundation, were starting to grow longer and more dominant. Episodes were still funny, often very funny, but the specific texture of the humor had shifted slightly, and there was something else, something harder to name but unmistakable to anyone who watched. The warmth that the original show had carried, that underlying sense that these people, no matter how ridiculous and chaotic their lives became, actually loved each other and would be there for each other. When things went wrong, that warmth had begun to cool. It was still present in the 4th season. It was still present enough in the 5th that most viewers could recognize and enjoy it. But it was beginning to diminish in ways that would only become clearer as the seasons continued to accumulate. The return of Family Guy also coincided, almost exactly, with the rise of YouTube. The video sharing platform launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy came back, and Family Guy's format turned out to be almost perfectly suited for the new way people were beginning to share comedy online. A 30-second cutaway gag could be clipped out of an episode, uploaded, and watched millions of times by people who had never seen or would never watch the full episode. Family Guy became, in this sense, one of the first shows to have its identity substantially shaped by how easily its parts could be isolated and distributed. The show's biggest cultural moments in the post-revival years were very often individual gags rather than complete episodes. People were watching Family Guy in fragments, and the show began, gradually, to be made in fragments. This is one of the quiet ironies of the show's second life. The format that made it so shareable also encouraged a kind of production philosophy that would contribute to the creative problems critics would later identify. If the clips were what people watched and shared and remembered, why invest as much energy in the connective tissue of the full episode? The answer: because great television requires great structure, and great structure creates the context in which even individual moments become meaningful, got lost somewhere in the analytics of clickability. Section 4. The characters and what made them actually work. Understanding why the early seasons of Family Guy were genuinely good requires looking closely at how each major character was constructed, because what made the show great in those years was not any single element in isolation, but the way all its moving parts fit together. Each character served a specific function within the family's ecosystem, and each was built with enough complexity that the function never felt mechanical. They felt like people, exaggerated cartoon people, but people nonetheless with internal lives, with contradictions, with histories that shaped how they behaved in the present. Peter Griffin was built on a very specific and carefully managed paradox. He was dumb in a way that required intelligence to write correctly. Making a character convincingly stupid while keeping them likable is harder than it sounds. The temptation is always to lean on the stupidity so heavily that the character becomes an object of contempt rather than comedy, a punching bag rather than a protagonist. The early show avoided this by giving Peter a quality that is harder to write than intelligence: genuineness. When Peter did something foolish, it was almost always because he genuinely believed he was doing something reasonable. His worldview was narrow and his information was usually wrong and his judgment was frequently catastrophic, but he was not operating in bad faith. He was a man who loved his family and his friends and his beer, who had strong feelings about things that did not warrant strong feelings, and who lacked almost entirely the capacity for self-reflection that might have made him a better person but also would have made him far less funny. The specifics of his character were drawn from McFarlane's own observations of a particular kind of New England working-class Catholic man. McFarlane said in one interview that his father had many friends of this type: big, loud, opinionated, bursting with personality, the kind of men who filled a room simply by entering it. Peter Griffin is a comic compression of that archetype. His voice came from a real person. His instincts came from a specific cultural world. The result is a character who reads as authentic even when what he is doing is completely absurd, because the absurdity is rooted in something recognizable. Lois Griffin is one of the more underappreciated constructions in the show's first 3 seasons. She was not simply Peter's keeper. She had a specific background, the daughter of Carter Pewterschmidt, a wealthy and dismissive businessman, and a woman who chose to step out of that world by marrying a man her parents found wholly unsuitable. That choice was never presented as pure romance or pure rebellion. It was presented as Lois genuinely loving this man in spite of everything her upbringing told her about what a suitable partner should look like. And Lois was not naive about Peter's limitations. She saw them clearly. She accommodated them with a pragmatism that was often funnier than any of the absurdist gags in the same episode, because it was rooted in a kind of resigned, affectionate realism. She had chosen this. She continued choosing it. Meg Griffin in the first 3 seasons was, deliberately, the most normal member of an abnormal family. This was the joke. Being ordinary in a household this spectacularly unusual made her invisible. She was not ugly or hateful or deserving of cruelty. She was just a teenager trying to be liked, trying to find her place, failing at school popularity in the completely mundane way that most teenagers fail at school popularity, and going largely unnoticed by everyone around her because everyone around her was operating at a level of chaos that drew all available attention toward itself. Her ordinariness was the point. It was a comment on how difficult it is to be normal in a world that rewards the spectacular, and it was compassionate in its execution. The early show liked Meg. It saw her clearly. That would change. Chris Griffin was the show's most purely absurdist main character, even beyond Stewie. He was heavyset and awkward and not especially bright. But unlike Peter, his lack of intelligence was not compensated by any particular emotional warmth. He simply existed in the family ecosystem in a state of perpetual mild bewilderment, occasionally producing utterances of surprising depth that he himself did not seem to understand, and then immediately retreating back into vacancy. He was, in a strange way, one of the most honest portraits in the early show of the chaos of adolescence, that period when someone could be simultaneously profound and hollow, insightful, and completely unaware. Glenn Quagmire, the family's neighbor, was a comedic vehicle built for one very specific purpose in the early seasons. He was the character who existed entirely in the present tense. Where Brian was burdened by his past and his failed ambitions, and where Peter was perpetually dragged back by consequences, Quagmire moved through life with the serial monofocus of a man who had simply decided that the present moment was all that mattered. His particular brand of charisma, that retro lounge effect, the specific cadence of his voice, the way he could say something genuinely disturbing in a tone that suggested he was very proud of himself, was a parody of a cultural type that the show deployed with consistent precision. He was a gag in himself, but a gag with a coherent internal logic. Joe Swanson, the wheelchair-using police officer who was another of Peter's closest friends, was introduced in the first season in an episode called A Hero Sits Next Door, and his arrival in the show's world was handled with a kind of care that the series would later struggle to maintain. Joe was not defined by his disability in those early appearances. He was defined by his competence, his toughness, his moral seriousness. Peter's initial response to Joe was jealousy. Everyone in the neighborhood liked and admired this man, and Peter could not understand why. That jealousy, and the process by which Peter came to genuinely like and respect Joe anyway, was a properly structured character arc, completed within a single episode but resonant beyond it. The show was telling us something real about male friendship and the way insecurity can get in the way of connection, and it was doing it within the framework of an adult animated comedy that had also, in the same episode, included a cutaway gag involving a talking elephant. The balance between those two things, the genuine emotional insight and the completely unhinged comedy, is what made the early show work so beautifully. Neither element undermined the other. They coexisted in a way that said something interesting about how real families actually function, in a permanent state of simultaneous absurdity and genuine feeling. Section 5. Inside the writer's room. The people who built the jokes. The process of making a Family Guy episode has been described by people who have done it as intensive, collaborative, and somewhat ritualistically strange. It has also been described by showrunner Alex Sulkin as having evolved significantly over the course of the show's history, in ways that reflect both the changing of the creative team and the changing circumstances of the industry around it. At its most straightforward, the process begins in a writer's room. The room at its fullest, in the middle seasons of the show, could hold between 15 and 25 writers, though the typical working day might see 15 to 20 of them present. A script in progress would be read aloud in a main room, scene by scene, with the assembled writers pitching jokes and alternatives as the reading progressed. When the script reached a point where a specific type of gag, a cutaway, a one-liner, a running bit needed to be filled, the room would pause. A group of 4 or 5 writers would be dispatched to a satellite room, which the staff called a gag room, and their assignment was to come up with 6 or 7 alternative versions of whatever gag needed to be written. They would return to the main room and pitch each alternative aloud, and the group would select the funniest. This is where the performance background of many Family Guy writers became an unusual asset. Steve Callahan, one of the show's long-serving executive producers, noted that a significant portion of the writing staff came from comedy performance backgrounds, stand-up, improv, sketch comedy. When they pitched a gag in the writer's room, they did not just read it off a page. They performed it. They did the voices, the timing, the physical gesture if a physical gesture was part of the joke. They put on a little song and dance, as Callahan described it, and the room responded to the performance as much as to the words. This made the selection process faster, and more intuitive than it might have been in a room of writers who were purely writers on paper. The script would then continue through multiple revision stages, each one corresponding to a different color of paper blue for a first draft, then pink, yellow, green, buff, salmon, tan, cherry, orchid, and so on through additional revision cycles. The color coding was a way of tracking exactly where in the production pipeline a given script was, and the range of colors involved takes its own story about how many times each episode was rethought, restructured, and refined before it was considered ready for the next stage. The table read was a crucial checkpoint. Voice actors came in, sat around a table, and read the script aloud in character. This was the moment when material that looked funny on paper might simply die in the air, landing without a response from the people in the room and immediately flagging itself as something that needed to be reconsidered. The inverse was also true. Lines that had seemed unremarkable in script form could come to life in a particular voice actor's delivery, acquiring a timing or an emphasis that the writer had not specifically planned for, but that the room immediately recognized as the correct version of the joke. After the table read, the episode moved into its animation phase. And this is where the geographic reality of the production becomes relevant, because the animation was largely done overseas, primarily in South Korea, which introduced its own particular challenges for quality control and timing. McFarlane, in a Reddit AMA, described the process as one with almost no shortcut available. The show's hand-drawn animation style, which he valued for the specific quality it gave the finished product, required time in a way that digital shortcuts could not replicate. People had tried using computer processes to accelerate the hand-drawn animation, and in his view, the results looked exactly like what they were, not like animation, but like a record of a computer doing animation. The distinction mattered to him. Each episode, from the moment a script was written to the moment a finished episode reached air, took approximately 10 months to complete. This was one of the concrete reasons why Family Guy rarely dealt with breaking news or very immediate current events. By the time an episode built around something happening today would be ready to broadcast, that event would have receded into last year's memory. The writers learned over time to make jokes about cultural attitudes rather than specific news events, because attitudes had a longer shelf life. McFarlane's involvement in the writers' room was total during the first decade of the show's run. According to Sulkin, having McFarlane physically present in the room was the single biggest advantage the show had in those years. He was not just the executive producer who occasionally dropped in to check on things. He was a working writer who sat with the staff, pitched jokes, shaped stories, and served as the de facto standard against which everything else in the room was measured. If McFarlane laughed, the joke was in. If he did not, the room kept going. His voice literally and figuratively was the tuning fork by which the entire creative enterprise was calibrated. This made his eventual departure from active writing duties all the more consequential. McFarlane himself said in a 2017 Reddit AMA that he had not written for the show since approximately 2010. Not that he had reduced his involvement, but that he had stopped writing for it entirely. He still voiced his characters. He still held the title of executive producer, but the creative decisions, the story ideas, the specific choices about what was funny and what was not, those were now being made by other people. By Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, who took over the show-running duties. By the writing staff they assembled and managed. By a room that was deeply aware of what McFarlane's sensibility looked like, but was necessarily working from memory and instinct rather than from his direct participation. Sulkin acknowledged this directly in an interview from late 2024, when he described the first decade of the show as a period when writers were essentially in constant, real-time calibration with the person who had invented the thing. Hearing McFarlane's voice in the room, hearing how he pitched a joke in the specific tonal register that the audience would eventually hear it in, built a kind of internal library for every writer who had that experience. The problem was that new writers who joined the staff later did not have access to that library. They were working from secondhand knowledge of a sensibility that had been cultivated from direct contact, and the difference is real even if it is difficult to articulate precisely. One of the more unusual facts about McFarlane's relationship to his own creation is that in the entire run of the show, across more than 450 episodes, McFarlane personally wrote only 3 of them. 3. Death Has a Shadow, the pilot, Family Guy Viewer Mail No. 1, which was a special format episode, and Stewie Loves Lois, the first episode of the show's revival in 2005. 3 scripts in a series that runs to nearly 30 seasons. Every other episode of Family Guy was written by someone else. MacFarlane shaped the show, defined its tone, built its characters, and voiced 4 of its most important figures. But the actual episode-by-episode writing was, almost from the beginning, a collective enterprise. The early writing staff had a specific character that departed from the average television writer's room. Gary Janetti, who would go on to become a successful showrunner in his own right, was part of the original team. Danny Smith, who has been with the show almost continuously, contributed enormously to the early texture of the comedy. Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, and Garrett Donovan were all significant voices in those first seasons. The combination of backgrounds, comedic sensibilities, and specific areas of reference in that room produced a humor that was broader in its range than any one person could have generated alone. There is something important to say about how the cutaway gag worked in the hands of this particular writing staff during those early years. Because the cutaway gag has become such a defining and contentious element of Family Guy's identity that it deserves its own careful examination. In the original seasons, the cutaway was genuinely a tool used with craft. A character would make a comparison, "This is worse than the time," or "I remember when," and the show would cut to a visual demonstration of that comparison. The transition was handled by the writing in a specific way. The setup line was funny in itself, the cutaway gag was funny in itself, and the return to the main story after the cutaway was managed so that the momentum of the episode had not been lost. 3 distinct comic beats from a single structural device. The key quality that distinguished those early cutaways from what they would later become was that they were short and they were specific. A good cutaway from the first 3 seasons made one joke and got out. It did not linger. It did not repeat itself. It did not attempt to mine additional value from a premise that had already yielded its best material. It was funny, it was gone, and the main story continued. The show's identity was shaped by this tool, but the story always existed independently of it. If you had removed every cutaway from a first-season episode of Family Guy, you would have had a somewhat thinner but entirely coherent and funny half-hour of television. The story worked. The characters worked. The cutaways were bonuses. Section 6. The animation story. How the show was drawn and why it mattered. Animation is a craft that most viewers experience without consciously registering how it works. You watch a cartoon and you react to what the characters do and say, and the question of how those images were created, which artists drew them, which studio produced them, what techniques were employed remains invisible in the background. But for a show like Family Guy, the history of its animation is not a trivial footnote. It is part of the story of how the show's character changed over time, and it illuminates something real about the relationship between visual style and comedic effect. The first season of Family Guy was animated by Film Roman, a studio that had significant experience with primetime animated television. They had worked on The Simpsons and King of the Hill, among others. The early episodes have a particular look. The line work is relatively thin and clean, the coloring is somewhat muted, and the character designs have the slightly tentative quality of a show that is still finding its visual language. But even in that first season, the animation had a quality of life to it that came from a clarity of intention. Each character was drawn consistently enough to be immediately recognizable, and the character designs themselves were doing real work. Peter's specific shape, Brian's careful posture, Stewie's perpetual expression of withering intelligence communicating personality before a single word of dialogue had been spoken. The second and third seasons were handled primarily by Rough Draft Studios, a Glendale-based animation house that had developed a strong reputation for quality in the industry. Rough Draft brought a specific kind of expressiveness to Family Guy's characters that fans of those seasons remember distinctly. The lines were less perfectly controlled, the movements had more spontaneity, and the overall effect was of animation that felt slightly handmade in a way that contributed rather than detracted. When Peter fell down a flight of stairs in a Rough Draft episode, you felt the weight of the fall in a way that was funny precisely because it was slightly imprecise. The body seemed to exist in actual space, governed by something approximating actual physics, and then violated those physics in the specific way that comedic cartoon physics required. After the show's revival in 2005, several different studios handled the animation at different points. The outlines on characters became more defined and consistent, the coloring more vivid, and the overall appearance more polished by any objective measure. But something was traded in the process. The scrappy quality of the rough draft seasons, the sense that this animation was slightly out of control in a way that matched the show's comedic energy, was replaced by something more regular and contained. The characters moved more safely. The physical comedy became more predictable in its execution. A show that had once felt like it was hurtling slightly beyond its own ability to control itself began to feel like a show that was very carefully managed. Some of the later seasons were handled in part by a studio called Digital E-Mation, whose work on the show was competent but drew criticism for producing animation that felt flat and rigid compared to earlier iterations. Other studios used digital drawing tablets that gave the visuals a cleaner but sometimes slightly uncanny quality. The characters looked right, the anatomy was correct, but something about the way they moved suggested they were being operated rather than inhabited. This is a subtle distinction, but animation viewers pick up on it even without being able to articulate it. There is a difference between animation that feels drawn and animation that feels generated, and it lives somewhere in the texture of the movement rather than in any single specific frame. McFarlane was consistently protective of the hand-drawn process, even as digital tools became more dominant in the industry, and pressure grew from production companies to embrace technologies that could reduce costs and timelines. He argued that the look of hand-drawn animation was irreplaceable, that computers could not replicate it without the result looking like a computer had been involved, and that the 10-month production timeline, expensive and exhausting as it was the cost of doing the show correctly. Whether or not one agrees with his aesthetic position, it is worth noting that the shows from the periods when he was most directly engaged with production decisions are, by almost any measure, the most visually alive. The relationship between the creator's investment and the quality of the finished product is one of those connections that is almost impossible to prove in isolation, but is consistently suggested by the historical record. One of the stranger facts about Family Guy's animation history concerns the voices. Every major character on the show had their voice settled before a single frame of animation was drawn. This is standard practice in animation. The voice tracks are recorded first, and the animators then synchronize the visual movements of the characters to the recorded audio. But in Family Guy's case, McFarlane was recording 4 distinct main characters in his voice sessions, which required a particular kind of discipline and stamina. A typical voice recording session for Family Guy would have McFarlane cycling through Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire within the same session, sometimes within the same scene, performing each character in sequence rather than simultaneously. The challenge was maintaining the internal consistency of each voice, while also ensuring that the performances complemented rather than competed with each other. This is not a problem that most voice actors face, because most voice actors play one character. The voice recording sessions were also where many of the show's best unexpected moments were born. McFarlane, like many voice actors, would occasionally go off-script during recording, pushing a line further, trying a different inflection, finding a texture in the moment that the written page had not anticipated. Some of these improvisations made it into finished episodes. The culture of the show encouraged performers to find those moments rather than simply execute what was written, and the writing staff was attentive enough to recognize when a recorded performance had outrun the script and to build on those discoveries in the next revision cycle. Patrick Warburton, who voiced Joe Swanson throughout the show's run, brought a very particular quality to the role that was largely his own creation. Warburton is physically imposing in real life, tall, broad, classically handsome in a jaw-first, heroic profile way, and the character of Joe Swanson seems specifically constructed to allow that physical energy to come through in a voice performance. Joe's voice has a forward momentum, a sense of purpose and authority that Warburton maintains consistently across hundreds of episodes. The contrast between that voice energy and Joe's physical situation, the wheelchair, the various indignities the later seasons subjected him to, is one of the show's more interesting ongoing tensions, though the later seasons exploited it less thoughtfully than the earlier ones. Section 7. Behind the scenes, secrets, facts, and things that almost never happened. Family Guy has accumulated, across its long production history, a substantial catalog of facts, stories, and pieces of trivia that illuminate the distance between what audiences see on screen and what actually happened to get it there. Some of these are well known among dedicated fans. Others are considerably more obscure. The name of McFarlane's production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, comes from the door of his apartment when he was a student at RISD. The door had a fuzzy texture for reasons that have not been entirely explained in any public account, and the name stuck in McFarlane's memory long enough that when he needed a name for the company he was forming, that image was what he reached for. The company has been attached to every major project McFarlane has produced. The first rejected television show McFarlane ever pitched to Fox was called Gumball 2 Gumball. The show was turned down. McFarlane never forgave them for it, or at least pretended not to forgive them enough to include a reference to it. In Family Guy itself, there is an episode in which Peter watches a show called Gumball 2 Gumball in a cutaway, a quiet inside joke that most viewers would have missed entirely unless they knew the backstory. Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, was pregnant on the show for a period that stretched across 116 episodes, effectively 7 seasons. This was not planned as a running gag in any organized sense. The writers simply kept the pregnancy going because they were not sure what to do with the baby, and the situation became increasingly absurd simply through accumulation. By the time the baby was finally born, the joke had been sustained for so long that the birth itself was almost an afterthought. Carol Burnett, the legendary comedian and actress, filed a copyright infringement lawsuit against 20th Century Fox in 2007 over a Family Guy episode from 2006 that included a brief parody of her famous charwoman cleaning woman character from the Carol Burnett show. Burnett objected to the use of her likeness and the specific character, which she argued was sufficiently associated with her identity to constitute infringement. The lawsuit was ultimately dismissed, with the court finding that the use constituted fair parody, but it drew attention to the legal complexities of the show's aggressive use of cultural references, celebrity likenesses, and iconic pop culture material. There are 2 versions of essentially every Family Guy episode. Network television operates under content guidelines that restrict what can be shown during prime time, and the episodes that aired on Fox were accordingly edited to comply with those guidelines. When Adult Swim began broadcasting reruns of the series, the episodes they received were often slightly different longer in some places, with material restored that had been cut for the broadcast version. DVD releases frequently included additional content that had never been aired in any context. For particularly devoted fans, tracking down the unedited versions of specific episodes became its own kind of treasure hunt. The show's relationship with real-life celebrities evolved over the years into something genuinely unusual. James Woods, the actor, became a recurring figure in the show's mythology, a version of himself, playing up the most extreme qualities of his public persona, appeared in multiple episodes. Woods was a good sport about the portrayals, and the joke eventually became a long-running bit where the show would use a trail of candy to capture James Woods by luring him step by step with his own apparent inability to resist taking whatever was in front of him. In one episode, a character is seen in the background of a news studio dressed as Peter Griffin, with a camera crew following him. This was a reference to James Woods, hidden in the background where only the most attentive viewers would catch it. The Stewie Building Blocks episode has one of the show's most compact Easter eggs. In an episode called Love Thy Trophy, Stewie can be seen playing with his building blocks in the background of a shot, and if you watch carefully, he has arranged them to spell re-drum the word from The Shining that Danny Torrance writes on doors and mirrors throughout the film, and which is, of course, murder spelled backward. It is a blink-and-miss-it moment that serves no plot function, exists for approximately 2 seconds of screen time, and perfectly captures the kind of background visual humor that rewards attentive viewing in a way that casual viewers would never notice. There is also the newspaper gag, which came in an episode called Model Misbehavior, where the Griffin family wins a boat race and their story is covered in the local paper. The main headline is visible, but if you freeze the frame and look at the smaller headline below it, it reads, DVDs paused for headline joke, millions disappointed. The joke is that the show's writers, knowing their audience well enough to know that people would pause DVDs to look for Easter eggs in newspaper headlines, put an Easter egg in a newspaper headline that was specifically about the phenomenon of people pausing DVDs to look for Easter eggs in newspaper headlines. The production of the Star Wars parody episodes beginning with Blue Harvest in the show's 6th season involved one of the most extensive productions the show had ever attempted at that point. McFarlane and the creative team mapped the original Star Wars film almost scene by scene and reconceived each element with Family Guy characters in the corresponding roles. The episode required additional animation resources, extended production time, and licensing clearances from Lucasfilm, which was at that point still an independent company rather than part of Disney. The finished product was, for many fans, one of the show's highlights of the post-revival era, an example of what the show could do when it committed to a single, large creative project, rather than assembling a collection of disconnected gags. Hidden within the Blue Harvest episode is a small collection of background characters from other animated shows. In the cantina scene, visible if you look carefully, you can spot Roger the alien from American Dad, Bender from Futurama, and a handful of other characters from other properties. These cameos were not announced and were placed specifically to reward the kind of frame-by-frame examination that dedicated fans were known to perform on the show's DVD releases. The show also has a consistent audio Easter egg that runs throughout its entire history. The phrase, "what the hell," appears in almost every single episode, said by one character or another in a wide variety of emotional registers. This is not purely an accident. The show's writers became aware of the pattern at some point and began consciously maintaining it, turning what might have been a statistical quirk into a deliberate running joke that exists entirely for the benefit of viewers attentive enough to keep count. Section 8. The controversies when the show went too far. Family Guy has been controversial for essentially its entire existence. It was controversial in 1999 when it premiered and conservative watchdog groups immediately began cataloging its offenses. It was controversial in 2006 when the Parents Television Council named it the worst primetime show for family viewing for the third time. It was controversial in 2010 when Fox refused to air an episode it had already paid to produce. It was controversial enough, at various points in its history, to generate international responses from governments that considered themselves the subjects of its satire. The show's relationship with controversy is not incidental to its identity. It is structural. The willingness to go to places that other programs would not go was baked into the show's DNA from the first episode. The organization that generated the most complaints about Family Guy over the years was the Parents Television Council, a conservative nonprofit that monitors broadcast television content for material it considers inappropriate. The PTC has named Family Guy the worst show of the week on at least 40 separate occasions. It filed formal indecency complaints with the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, against specific episodes on multiple occasions. The FCC, to its credit, generally declined to act on these complaints, finding that the material in question did not meet the legal standard for indecent broadcast content. The complaint process was, in at least one case, more of a coordinated campaign than a spontaneous public response. An FCC estimate from the early 2000s found that 99.8% of all indecency complaints received by the Commission in 2003 were filed through the PTC. The organization was, in effect, the FCC complaints process rather than merely one contributor to it. The most watched episode in terms of complaint volume was a Season 7 episode called Family Gay, in which Peter participates in medical experiments and receives an injection described as the gay gene, temporarily becoming gay and leaving Lois for another man before being, through a sequence of events involving Stewie and Brian, sent to a conversion therapy camp. The episode generated more than 188,000 FCC complaints. Whether that number reflects genuine, widespread public offense or a coordinated filing campaign is a question the historical record leaves somewhat open. The episode is considered by many television critics to be a relatively sophisticated satirical treatment of both gay conversion therapy and the cultural debate around sexual orientation, but it is also an episode of Family Guy, which means the treatment is never purely earnest and always weighted toward the comedic end of the spectrum. The single most discussed banned episode in the show's history is Partial Terms of Endearment, which was produced as part of the 8th season but has never aired on American television and, as of this writing, has never been added to the show's American streaming library. The episode concerns Lois agreeing to be a surrogate mother for an old college friend. When the friend and her husband are killed in a car accident, Lois is left to decide whether to continue the pregnancy or terminate it. The episode handles the abortion question with a surprising degree of nuance for a comedy series. It presents multiple perspectives, allows different characters to hold different positions, and arrives at a specific conclusion rather than hedging. Fox decided before the season had even begun airing that the episode was simply too politically charged to broadcast. The then president of Fox, Kevin Riley, explained the decision by describing it as a matter of not wanting to invite the kind of controversy that could result in advertiser withdrawals or public pressure campaigns. He acknowledged that the episode itself was handled well. The problem was not the quality. The problem was the topic. The BBC in the UK aired the episode without incident. It reached approximately 1 million households and received positive reviews. The episode was included on the Season 8 DVD set, which means anyone who wanted to see it could acquire it. MacFarlane disagreed publicly with the decision to ban it, arguing that treating abortion as a topic inherently off-limits for satirical comedy was indefensible, particularly when the show had already made jokes about virtually everything else. An earlier episode called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, from the third season, had its own complicated broadcast history. The episode was completed in time to air as part of Season 3, but was pulled by Fox over concerns that certain jokes about Jewish people and religion might be read as anti-Semitic. The episode did eventually air, several years later, but its delayed premiere became a small piece of the show's history evidence that the same network willing to broadcast almost anything also had specific sensitivities about specific kinds of content. The Turban Cowboy episode from Season 11 is perhaps the most complicated entry in the show's controversy catalog because it was not controversial at the time it aired, in March of 2013, but became retroactively so when, 1 month after its premiere, the Boston Marathon bombing killed 3 people and injured hundreds. The episode contains a cutaway gag in which Peter drives through the Boston Marathon in a car, hitting and killing runners. The gag predated the attack by a month. Once the attack happened, the episode was pulled from reruns and streaming platforms. Its eventual return to Hulu did not come until September of 2022, nearly a decade later. Then there is the matter of international responses. The Venezuelan government, during the broadcast of a Season 7 episode about Brian leading a marijuana legalization campaign in the Griffin family's town, took formal action. The country's justice minister cited the episode as an example of American media promoting drug use, and Venezuelan cable stations were warned they would face fines if they continued airing Family Guy. This was and remains one of the more remarkable instances of a cartoon generating a response from a national government. Russia came close to a similar outcome in more recent seasons, when a 2-part episode involving Meg traveling to Russia and encountering storylines that the Russian government found unflattering generated formal complaints and threats of a ban. The episode survived, barely, and Family Guy continues to air in Russia as of the most recent available information. The Parents Television Council's complaints about the show extended beyond specific episodes to the general practice of what it called the show's reliance on shock value for comedic effect. This criticism that the show had, particularly in its later seasons, replaced genuine wit with the crude leverage of saying something extreme and waiting for a reaction was shared by critics who had no particular political agenda. The argument was not that the show was too offensive, but that it had become less intelligent about how it used offense. Early Family Guy used dark humor as a delivery mechanism for something. Later, Family Guy increasingly used darkness as the destination. The distinction between those two positions is the difference between satire and spectacle. The FCC, for its part, maintained a fairly consistent position throughout the show's history, that Family Guy, whatever its excesses, generally operated within the bounds of what broadcast television was permitted to broadcast. The most specific successful complaint against the show was a relatively technical finding about an early rebroadcast, and even that was decided on procedural grounds, rather than on the substantive question of whether the content was harmful. The regulatory apparatus of American broadcast television was, in most cases, simply not equipped to process the kind of complaint that Family Guy's critics were making. The law protected a broad range of speech, and Family Guy consistently stayed just inside that range not because it was carefully calibrated to do so, but because American broadcast law has always tolerated considerably more than the organizations cataloging its outrages preferred. Section 9. Seth MacFarlane, the man himself. There is a version of Seth MacFarlane's story that is purely a professional success narrative. Young man from Connecticut, artistically gifted from earliest childhood, studies animation at a prestigious institution, gets hired by a major studio straight out of school, pitches a television series to a broadcast network at 24, gets a deal, creates a show that becomes a billion-dollar franchise, writes and directs Hollywood films, hosts the Academy Awards, releases jazz and big band albums that earn Grammy nominations, creates additional successful television series, signs a production deal worth approximately $200 million. That story is all true. It is also incomplete because it leaves out the texture of the person behind the resume, the specific character of MacFarlane's sense of humor, his politics, his relationships with the institutions he worked within, and the near miss that gave his entire life story a completely different shape. Seth MacFarlane was supposed to be on American Airlines Flight 11 on the morning of September 11th, 2001. This is not rumor or urban legend. It is a verified biographical fact that MacFarlane has spoken about in multiple public contexts and with considerable candor. He had been giving a lecture at RISD, his alma mater, the night before. He went out afterward and had a few drinks with people, stayed up later than he had intended, and overslept the next morning. His travel agent had also given him the wrong departure time for his flight. She told him the flight was leaving at 8:15 in the morning when it was actually leaving at 7:45. He arrived at the airport with two of these factors working against him simultaneously, and he missed the gate closure by approximately 10 minutes. He went to the airport lounge and fell asleep. When he woke up 40 minutes later, something was wrong. He learned what had happened. Flight 11, the Boston to Los Angeles flight he had missed, had struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 in the morning. Everyone on board was killed. MacFarlane later contacted his assistant to confirm that he was alive because people had already begun to worry his name appeared on the passenger manifest and they had not heard from him. The bartender in the airport lounge, when MacFarlane mentioned that he had been scheduled to be on that flight, poured him a drink on the house. MacFarlane sent his travel agent a basket of alcohol as a thank you. He has said in interviews that the experience was rattling for the first few weeks, and then he settled back into something like his normal orientation toward existence, not fatalistic, not prone to seeing special significance in the coincidence. One of many near misses that people experience throughout their lives, he observed, most of them invisible to us because we never find out what would have happened if the timing had been different. His religious position, or rather, his secular position, has been one of the most consistent elements of his public identity across his career. MacFarlane is an outspoken atheist, and this orientation is woven throughout Family Guy in ways that range from the subtle to the conspicuous. God appears as a character in the show, and is generally portrayed as fallible, petty, occasionally cruel, and much more interested in getting dates than in administering cosmic justice. Jesus appears as a character as well, with similar treatment. Religion as an institutional force is almost always the object of satire rather than the subject of respect. These choices generated complaints from religious organizations throughout the show's history, but MacFarlane was consistent about his position, and the show remained consistent in how it expressed that position. His political views are liberal, and have been consistently liberal throughout his public life. He donated to Democratic political candidates. He made his views on gun control and environmental policy known publicly. His relationship with Fox Broadcasting Company was colored throughout by the fact that Fox shared corporate lineage with Fox News, an institution whose programming MacFarlane found antithetical to his own beliefs. In 2021, this tension broke into the open when MacFarlane posted publicly on social media that Tucker Carlson's commentary on Fox News made him wish Family Guy were airing on any other network. He compared his relationship with Fox to a failing marriage, in which both sides knew it was not working. This public statement from the creator of one of Fox's longest-running and most profitable shows was a remarkable act of transparency, and it came in the context of a larger career migration that MacFarlane had already been engineering. In 2020, he signed a deal with NBC Universal, reportedly in the range of $200 million over 5 years, that moved his production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, away from the Fox corporate ecosystem and into the Comcast family of networks and platforms. His science fiction series The Orville, which he had created and starred in, moved from Fox to Hulu. A live-action Ted prequel series was produced for Peacock, the NBC Universal streaming platform. MacFarlane was building his future somewhere else. Family Guy was the thing keeping him anchored to Fox. He was contractually obligated to continue voicing his characters. He was still technically the executive producer, but he was emotionally and professionally oriented toward other projects on other networks, and the show he had created reflected that ambivalence in its later seasons in ways that are difficult to quantify but easy to feel. MacFarlane's career beyond Family Guy is worth understanding in its own right, because it illuminates something about the scale of his ambitions and the breadth of his creative interests. The 2012 film Ted, which he wrote, directed, and starred in as the voice of a talking teddy bear, grossed more than $500 million worldwide. It is one of the highest-grossing original comedy films in Hollywood history. The follow-up, Ted 2 in 2015, was considerably less successful but still commercially viable. A Million Ways to Die in the West in 2014, which he wrote, directed, and appeared in front of the camera in as the lead, was a more qualified commercial success but demonstrated his continued appetite for directing live-action feature film work. The Orville, which premiered in 2017, showed a different side of MacFarlane's creative personality, something much more earnest, more emotionally direct, more interested in the sincere possibilities of science fiction as a genre, rather than in its satirical potential. The Orville was, in some ways, the show that Family Guy could never be. It cared about its characters' emotional lives without the layer of ironic distance that Family Guy's format required. MacFarlane has also released multiple albums of big band and jazz standards, music drawn from the tradition he calls the Great American Songbook, the music of Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Bing Crosby, and their contemporaries. His voice is a genuine baritone with real training behind it. The voice lessons he received from the elderly couple who had also trained Sinatra were evidently not wasted. He has performed at Carnegie Hall, the Hollywood Bowl, and the Royal Albert Hall. This is not the typical secondary creative project of a television producer. It is a separate artistic identity, pursued with real commitment and received with real appreciation. The tension between all of these identities, the creator of a raucous adult animated comedy, the Hollywood film director, the sincere science fiction storyteller, the jazz vocalist, is part of what makes MacFarlane difficult to categorize. He is not simply the guy who made Family Guy. He is someone for whom Family Guy was one of many expressions of a creative personality that operates across multiple registers simultaneously, which perhaps helps explain why he was able to step back from day-to-day creative involvement in the show without the experience of abandoning something that defined him. He had other definitions available. Section 10. The Road to Everywhere: The Music and the Songs. One of the most consistently underappreciated aspects of Family Guy is its musical ambition. The show is, in a very real sense, a musical comedy, not in the sense that it is a traditional musical where characters spontaneously sing to express their inner states, but in the sense that music is woven into its texture in a way that goes considerably beyond incidental scoring. The show writes and performs original songs regularly, some of which are among the most ambitious comedic musical productions that American television has ever attempted. This ambition traces directly to MacFarlane's own musical background and sensibilities. His love for the Bing Crosby and Bob Hope Road to films of the 1940s, a series of 7 comedy adventure films in which the two stars traded banter, chased Dorothy Lamour, and navigated exotic settings with cheerful incompetence, was genuine and deep. When he looked for a structural template for special episodes featuring Brian and Stewie on extended adventures, the Road to format was the obvious choice. The first of the Road to episodes, Road to Rhode Island, aired in the second season in the year 2000 and established the format that would generate 7 more installments over the following decades. The Road to Rhode Island episode was directed by Dan Povenmire, who would later create the enormously successful Phineas and Ferb. MacFarlane gave Povenmire substantial creative freedom for the episode, specifically telling him that he had 2 minutes to fill with visual gags and that he trusted Povenmire to do whatever he wanted with them. The episode's musical centerpiece, the titular Road to Rhode Island song, sung by Brian and Stewie while riding a freight train, was built on a melody lifted from the 1942 film Road to Morocco, the Bing Crosby Bob Hope song of that name. The adaptation acknowledged its source openly, drawing a direct line between the show's comedy and the classic Hollywood tradition that inspired it. The episode was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award in the Outstanding Animated Program category. The show's primary composer, Walter Murphy, brought serious musical credentials to his work on Family Guy. Murphy had previously worked on Saturday Night Fever, among other projects, and his orchestral arrangements for the show's musical numbers gave them a production scale that was genuinely surprising coming from an animated sitcom. The songs in the Road to episodes were not throwaway parody songs produced cheaply and quickly. They were crafted compositions recorded with full orchestral backing, rehearsed until they were polished, and designed to function as real entertainment independent of their comedic context. You could strip the humor from many of Family Guy's best musical numbers and still have something that worked as music. The breadth of the show's musical parody catalog is remarkable. Sheepoopy from The Music Man was performed in a Season 4 episode by Peter Griffin in a spontaneous stadium production number after he scored a touchdown for the New England Patriots, and the choice of that specific song, the most deliberately antiquated and dorky song in a show already full of antiquated and dorky musical references, was itself a kind of second-order joke about Peter's particular cultural landscape. The FCC, a song from Season 4 criticizing the Federal Communications Commission, was an original composition that played with the conventions of protest anthem structure while also being genuinely funny. The Emmy Award-winning You've Got a Lot to See, from an episode featuring Brian and an older woman named Pearl, was a love song of sorts. Warm and specific, and oddly affecting in a way that caught viewers off guard. Prom Night Dumpster Baby is one of the show's more uncomfortable musical achievements. It appeared in an episode dealing with teenage pregnancy, and its subject, a baby abandoned in a dumpster on prom night, reflecting on its circumstances in the style of a 1950s doo-wop ballad, is about as dark as the show's dark humor ever got. The joke worked because the musical form cheerful, jangly, nostalgic, emotionally optimistic in the way that doo-wop inherently is, was so completely at odds with the subject matter that the contrast became its own kind of comedy. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a comment on the way popular music has always managed to make everything sound better than it is. The Road to Multiverse episode from Season 8 is perhaps the single most technically ambitious thing the show ever produced from a musical standpoint. The episode's premise, Stewie has built a device that allows him and Brian to travel between parallel universes, gave the writers the opportunity to animate different universe settings in different animation styles. One universe is rendered in the style of 1930s Disney animation, complete with a song called It's a Wonderful Day for Pie that captures the specific musical aesthetic of that era with uncomfortable precision. Another universe is rendered as a Japanese anime, another as a Flintstone-style cartoon. The musical component of the Disney parody sequence required the show's composers to reverse engineer the specific sound of early Disney songs, the specific tempo, the specific instrumentation, the specific melodic structure, and then rebuild something original that would function as authentic parody rather than mere imitation. They did it well enough that the sequence is routinely cited as one of the most entertaining the show ever produced. The show also made a particular musical tradition of its holiday episodes. Christmas Time is Killing Us, From the Road to the North Pole two-parter in Season 9, is a cynical holiday anthem performed in a jazz-inflected big band style that owes something obvious to McFarlane's personal musical tastes. The lyrics catalog the ways in which the commercial machinery of Christmas makes people miserable, while the orchestration treats the same material with the kind of warmth and swing that genuine Christmas standards aspire to. The disjunction is funny and true and executed with considerable skill. There is something worth pausing on here about the show's relationship to its own musical numbers, because it speaks to something larger about the show's creative personality in its best periods. When the show committed to a musical sequence, it committed fully. It did not do this halfway. It hired real musicians, paid for real arrangements, gave the voice cast time to rehearse and fine the performances. The results were sometimes the most ambitious things the show attempted in a given season, and they were possible only because the people making them believed that something worth making deserved to be made well. This is a different creative philosophy from the one that produced the Conway Twitty gag The Running Bit in later seasons, where, rather than providing an original joke, the show would simply broadcast an extended clip of the country singer performing one of his actual songs, with the length of the clip serving as both the setup and the punchline. The gap between those two approaches to music on the show is the gap between the show at its best and the show at its most indifferent. Section 11. When the show predicted real life, the strange history of Family Guy's accidental prophecies. Every long-running satirical comedy that engages closely with contemporary culture will, at some point, appear to have predicted something. This is a mathematical inevitability rather than a mystical phenomenon. The show that makes enough jokes about enough things will sometimes make a joke that subsequently happens. The Simpsons is the most famous beneficiary of this observation, having produced jokes about Donald Trump's presidency, FaceTime-style video calls, and various other developments years before they occurred. Family Guy has its own catalog of apparent predictions, and while none of them rise to the level of genuine prophecy, they do illuminate something interesting about how closely the show was tracking the shape of its cultural moment. The most frequently cited example involves a gag from a 2005 episode about a fictitious product related to the show called Pawtucket Patriot Ale. The gag, which takes a gentle jab at the practice of supermarket cheese delivery subscription services, was later pointed to as an apparent precursor to the rise of specific food delivery subscription models that became common in the following decade. The parallel is loose enough that it probably tells us more about how predictable certain commercial trends were than about any particular insight the writers had. More significant is a cutaway gag from a much earlier episode, from before the show's first cancellation, in which Stewie is seen in an airport security line, distracting the guards from the weapons concealed in his luggage. He then makes a joking reference about Osama bin Laden using a similar tactic. The gag was produced and broadcast before September 11th, 2001. When the attacks happened, the gag became, retroactively, exactly the kind of material that could not be left in circulation without causing distress. It was removed from reruns and from the initial DVD releases. It has since reappeared on some streaming platforms, with the passage of time providing enough distance for it to be experienced as historical artifact, rather than as active wound. There is also the Boston Marathon episode. Turban Cowboy, which aired in March of 2013, contained a cutaway gag showing Peter driving through the Boston Marathon and killing runners. Exactly 1 month later, the Boston Marathon bombing killed 3 people and wounded hundreds of others. The episode was not pulled from streaming immediately. It took time for the connection to be noticed and processed, but once the parallel between the gag and the actual attack became widely discussed, the episode was removed from television rerun packages and streaming platforms. It took nearly a decade to be made available again. These are not cases of genuine prediction. They are cases of a show that was drawing on real anxieties, real social tensions, and real cultural patterns, and finding that the anxieties and tensions it exaggerated for comedic effect occasionally materialized in ways that were much less funny than the cartoon version had been. The difference between a cutaway gag about airport security and the reality of September 11th is not one of kind, but of degree, and the degree matters enormously. The jokes were possible because the underlying fears they tapped were already present in the culture. That is what makes dark comedy work when it works. It is also what makes dark comedy painful when reality catches up to it. MacFarlane's own near miss with the September 11th attacks introduced a layer of personal complexity to all of this. He was a man who had been scheduled to die on the same morning that the show he created was being preemptively implicated, however tangentially, in the cultural anxieties about airport security. He later addressed the September 11th attacks directly in the show, in a 2011 episode called Back to the Pilot, in which Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the events of the first episode, and Brian realizes he has an opportunity to prevent the attacks. The episode did not use this premise to make light of the tragedy. It used it as a meditation on consequence and moral responsibility, asking whether preventing one catastrophe might enable a worse one. The critical response to the episode was mixed. Some viewers found it thought-provoking. Others found the use of September 11th for any comedic purpose inappropriate. But MacFarlane's own history with the date gave the episode a texture that was absent from the critical reception. There is also the matter of what the show appeared to predict about celebrity news cycles, political scandals, and shifts in public attitudes. Several episodes from the mid to late seasons touched on matters that were, at the time of production, satirical exaggerations, and that subsequently became literal descriptions. An episode about a specific technology company's aggressive data collection practices aired years before the Cambridge Analytica scandal made those practices household knowledge. An episode about the gap between a celebrity's public persona and their private behavior aired, while the celebrity in question was still largely untouched by the specific revelations that would later confirm the show's implied assessment. These connections are easier to identify in retrospect than they were to notice in real time, which is precisely the nature of satire that has aged into documentation. What the show's history of apparent predictions actually reveals is something about the nature of sustained satirical attention. A show that watches its culture closely enough, for long enough, will eventually produce a record that looks like prophecy simply because prediction and close observation are hard to distinguish in retrospect. Family Guy, at its best, watched American culture with the kind of specific, slightly uncomfortable attention that made it possible to anticipate where certain tendencies were heading, not because anyone on the writing staff had particular insight, but because they were paying attention in the way that satirists pay attention, which is more systematic and less charitable than the way most people process their cultural environment. Section 12. The legacy, the streaming era, and what it all actually means. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999. As this script is being written, the show has been renewed through what will be its 27th season, with episodes guaranteed to be produced into the 2028 to 2029 television year. That would make Family Guy approximately 30 years old when it completes those seasons. 30 years. The show that MacFarlane drew in his kitchen at 24 years old, voicing the characters in his head before they had any visual form, will by that point have existed for roughly half of his entire life. In 2009, Family Guy received a nomination for the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series. This was not a minor achievement. It was, in fact, historic, the first time any animated series had been nominated in that category since The Flintstones in 1961, almost 50 years earlier. Not even The Simpsons, which by 2009 had been on the air for 20 years and had generated more critical acclaim than almost any other television comedy ever made, had received that recognition. Family Guy won it, briefly and by nomination alone, and then the show continued and the cultural landscape continued and the history moved on. In 2013, TV Guide ranked Family Guy the 9th greatest television cartoon of all time. These benchmarks, the Emmy nomination, the TV Guide ranking, the billion-dollar franchise valuation, the 22 million viewers at the first broadcast, are the markers of a show that once occupied a position of genuine cultural centrality. It was not just popular. It was important in the way that cultural artifacts can be important, shaping how people thought about the possibilities of the medium, influencing what other creators believed they were permitted to try, demonstrating that animated television for adults was a category that could sustain serious creative ambition. The show's path through the streaming era has been one of the more interesting case studies in how older television content adapts to the new distribution reality. Family Guy has been on Hulu as its primary American streaming home, and its performance there has been strong at various points. It has been the second most watched show on the platform, behind only Saturday Night Live. This streaming performance exists in direct contrast to its broadcast ratings, which have declined to a fraction of what they were at the show's peak. The audience for Family Guy's new episodes, the people watching on Wednesday nights on Fox with the rest of the show's diminished live viewership, is a different audience from the much larger one that experiences the show through streaming and reruns. The show is, in this sense, two different objects simultaneously: a modestly performing new broadcast program and one of the most consistently watched older television comedies on streaming platforms. The show left Adult Swim in 2021 when the licensing agreement between Cartoon Network's parent company and Disney, which had acquired the 20th Century Fox Entertainment assets, and therefore Family Guy, as part of its purchase of 21st Century Fox, expired without renewal. Adult Swim marked the departure with a remembrance bumper, an acknowledgement of the show's significance to the block that had helped save it. Animated characters from other Adult Swim shows gathered to wave goodbye to the Griffin family. It was, in its way, a genuinely affecting moment, two institutions recognizing the role they had played in each other's history. Comedy Central struck a licensing deal for Family Guy reruns in 2024, launching it with an all-day marathon on Labor Day. Then, in January of 2025, Family Guy returned to Adult Swim under a new, non-exclusive licensing agreement, the first time the show had been on the network since 2021. Michael Aweline, the president of Adult Swim, described the reunion in terms that reflected the shared history. Adult Swim was a huge part of Family Guy's early story, and bringing it back felt like honoring that history while adding something valuable to the network's current lineup. The production deal announced in April of 2025 4 additional seasons, seasons 24 through 27, extending the show's run through the 2028 to 2029 television year, was described in the press as a mega deal with Disney, reflecting the enormous ongoing commercial value of the show's library and brand. Each season under this deal would consist of 15 episodes rather than the 22 or so that had been the standard for most of the show's earlier years. This reduction in episode count is not unprecedented in the industry. It reflects both the changing economics of broadcast television and the recognition that fewer, better-produced episodes are often preferable to more episodes produced under greater time pressure, but it does mean that the show's remaining run will produce less total content than its earlier seasons did at comparable intervals. The cultural influence of Family Guy on the landscape of adult animation is significant and worth documenting, even if the influence is sometimes acknowledged in terms of what not to do as much as what to do. Shows that came after Family Guy, Bob's Burgers, Archer, Rick and Morty, among others, were all shaped in part by the space that Family Guy helped define and defend. The idea that animated comedy for adults could be sophisticated, could carry genuine emotional weight, could experiment with form and format and genre, was not invented by Family Guy but was significantly expanded and normalized by it during the period when it was at its creative best. Bob's Burgers, which shares the Fox Sunday night lineup with Family Guy and has often been discussed as the more artistically consistent of the two in the later years of both shows' runs, explicitly rejected several elements of the Family Guy model: the cutaway gag structure, the cruelty towards specific family members, the reliance on shock for its own sake in favor of a warmer, more character-driven approach that some critics have argued represents a kind of corrective to what Family Guy got wrong. Bob's Burgers creator Loren Bouchard has been direct about the influence of the Sunday animation block on his show's philosophy, and indirect about but clearly aware of the example Family Guy provided of what happens when a show loses its warmth. Rick and Morty, the Adult Swim science fiction comedy that became one of the defining animated shows of the 2010s, shares with Family Guy a willingness to explore genuinely dark territory and a formal restlessness that produces episodes radically different from one another in tone and structure. But Rick and Morty maintained something that Family Guy lost: a consistent sense that the darkness had stakes, that the characters were genuinely affected by what happened to them, that the emotional weight of an episode carried forward into subsequent ones, rather than resetting at the end of each half hour. The question of why some long-running shows manage to maintain creative vitality while others decline is one of the more interesting problems in television history, and Family Guy is one of the clearest case studies in the mechanics of decline. The evidence gathered across its history points towards several specific factors: the departure of the original creative force and the loss of the specific calibration he provided, the structural consequences of a format that rewarded fragments over narrative coherence, the gradual erosion of the warmth that gave the comedic excess something to play against, and the absence of genuine consequence in a show that kept resetting its emotional stakes to zero at the end of each episode. The Simpsons, facing many of the same challenges as a show that has now aired for more than 35 years, took a different path through its own long arc. The early Simpsons established characters with such depth that decades of inconsistent writing have not entirely obscured the original designs. Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie retain, even in the most undistinguished recent seasons, enough of their essential identity to be recognizable as the people they were in the show's golden era. Family Guy's characters underwent more radical transformations, becoming, in many cases, substantially different people from who they were designed to be. American Dad, the show that MacFarlane co-created with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman, and that premiered the same year Family Guy was revived, presents the most direct point of comparison. The two shows launched from the same creator at the same cultural moment on the same network. American Dad chose not to use cutaway gags at all, a structural decision that forced its writing staff to build every episode around actual narrative, rather than around the connective tissue between gags. It allowed its characters, particularly Stan Smith and Roger the Alien, to develop in ways that maintained their core identities while accommodating genuine change over time. Its transition from Fox to TBS in 2014 gave its writers more creative freedom than they had had under broadcast standards and practices. By almost any measure of critical consensus, American Dad is today the better show, and the fact that both shows came from the same original creative lineage makes this comparison more instructive rather than less. The difference was not talent. The difference was choices. Family Guy chose what it chose, and the choices accumulated over time into a specific outcome. The character of Peter Griffin evolved from a lovable and fundamentally decent fool into something genuinely difficult to root for. The character of Brian Griffin evolved from the show's moral compass into a figure whose pretensions made him the object of contempt. Stewie surrendered the specific originality that made him singular in exchange for a warmer but far less unique identity. Meg was treated in ways that the show's own writers eventually recognized as excessive, and the correction that arrived in the later seasons came too late to undo the cumulative damage. The cutaway gag, the show's defining comic tool, became in the later seasons a substitute for the storytelling it had originally supplemented. The sharp satirical intelligence of the early seasons gave way, gradually and then more rapidly, to a preference for impact over thought. The warmth that made the Griffin family worth spending time with, the sense that underneath all the chaos, they were a real family who loved each other, was depleted by years of stories that treated them as props in their own lives, rather than as people. And yet the show produced, across those same later seasons, episodes that rivaled anything in its history. The 8th season episode, Brian and Stewie, in which the two characters are locked in a bank vault for an entire episode and do nothing but talk, with no cutaway gags, no slapstick, no outside plot. Just two characters having genuinely difficult conversations about their lives and their friendship and their darkest fears is as good as television gets. Brian's revelation that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because there have been times when he thought about using it on himself, and Stewie's response to that revelation is a moment of authentic emotional weight that has no equal in the show's catalog of absurdist comedy. The talent was never gone. The inclination to use it consistently was what had frayed. The show also, across its long history, demonstrated repeatedly that it was capable of genuine social commentary when it was willing to do the work. Episodes addressing gun violence, drug policy, disability, sexuality, and the specific mechanics of American corporate and political culture produced some of the most interesting things that animated television has attempted. The Partial Terms of Endearment episode, still unaired on American television after all these years, is by most accounts one of the more thoughtful treatments of abortion that American broadcast comedy has ever produced, and the fact that no American television audience has been able to see it in its proper context says something uncomfortable about the limits of what satire is permitted to do in this particular culture. What Family Guy ultimately represents in the history of American television is both a creative achievement and a cautionary tale, and both of those things are true simultaneously. It demonstrated that animated adult comedy could achieve genuine artistic ambition, that an idea born in a thesis film at a small art school could become a billion-dollar franchise built on genuine creative vision. It also demonstrated how a show can lose its way not all at once, not through any single catastrophic decision, but through the accumulation of small compromises, structural shifts, and creative departures that individually seem manageable and collectively become irreversible. MacFarlane's decision in April of 2024 to explain the show's continued production primarily in terms of its commercial viability and its utility as a funding source for causes he believed in. He cited organizations like Rainforest Trust as beneficiaries of the income generated by Family Guy. Was honest in a way that was also somewhat melancholy. He did not describe creative stories he was eager to tell or character directions he was excited to explore. He described a machine that was running well and producing outcomes he found valuable for reasons that were not entirely artistic. This is a reasonable position for a man to take about a show that has been running for a quarter century. It is also a different position from the one that produced the show in the first place. The show that will air its final episode, whenever that is, whenever the deal runs out or the audience finally falls below whatever threshold Fox and Disney consider viable, will be a very different program from the one that aired after Super Bowl 33 in January of 1999. Some of those differences represent natural evolution, the way any creative work changes over time when the people making it change and the world around it changes. Others represent something more specific, the gradual loss of the particular combination of ingredients that made the original Family Guy work, and the inability or perhaps the simple unwillingness to reconstitute those ingredients once they had dispersed. The golden era is not mythologized. It was real. The first 3 seasons of Family Guy are genuinely, measurably, objectively better television than the vast majority of what the show has produced since then. They are also better, in most of the ways that count, than the vast majority of animated comedy that has been produced by anyone. They established a standard that the show's own later seasons could not meet, and the gap between those seasons and where the show ended up is one of the more fascinating and somewhat sad journeys in American entertainment history. But here is the thing about that gap. And here is where this long journey through the making and the unmaking of Family Guy arrives at something that feels important. The early seasons still exist. They are still there. The episodes are still on Hulu, still on DVD, still accessible to anyone who wants to experience the show at its best. Brian still has his dry wit and his novel in progress. Stewie still plots improbable acts of maternal homicide. Peter still loves Lois in a way that is fumbling and excessive and completely sincere. The warmth is still in those episodes. The heart is still beating. The story of Family Guy is not simply a story of decline. It is a story about what happens when something genuinely great tries to survive the conditions that eventually come for everything. Great commercial pressure, the passage of time, the dispersal of the specific people whose specific combination made the thing what it was, the slow entropy that comes for all long-running creative works. It is also, in the episodes where it managed to resist those forces even in its later years, a story about the persistence of talent and the way that something true about human beings, their capacity for love and comedy and absurdity and genuine connection can surface through even the most compromised, creative circumstances. Family Guy, at its core, is a show about a family. Not a perfect family, not even a particularly functional family, but a family that chose each other and keeps choosing each other even when the choosing is hard and the results are mixed. That is a story worth telling. For the roughly 3 seasons when it told that story with full and undivided creative attention, it told it as well as it has ever been told in animated comedy. And those 3 seasons, and the individual flashes of that same quality that appeared throughout the longer run, are the reason the show still matters not as a lesson in what not to do, but as evidence of what is possible when someone starts with a talking dog and a handful of voices in their head and pours everything they have into the work. That boy from Kent, Connecticut, drawing Woody Woodpecker at 2 years old, asking his parents how the cartoons moved, he figured something out about movement that he spent the rest of his career trying to recreate. On the nights when he got it exactly right, the characters moved in a way that felt alive. Not because of the technology or the production budget or the prime time slot, because somebody cared enough to make them breathe. That is the story. All of it, the Connecticut childhood, the Rhode Island thesis film, the Hollywood deal, the 2 cancellations, the DVD miracle, the resurrection, the rivalries and controversies and near-prophetic gags, and the man who should have been on a flight that never landed. All of it is the story of Family Guy, which is to say, all of it is the story of what happens when one person's strange, specific vision of the world becomes, somehow, exactly what millions of other people needed to see. If this video kept you company tonight, if you learned something you didn't know before, if the quiet of wherever you're listening from felt a little less quiet, that's what this is for. Hit subscribe if you haven't. Leave a comment about anything. Come back next time. Sleep well. End of script. Total approximate word count, 32,000 plus words. Section 13. The giant chicken, the cutaway, and the anatomy of a joke. There are certain recurring elements in Family Guy that function less like plot devices and more like structural institutions, things so embedded in the show's identity that to remove them would be to change what the show fundamentally was. The giant chicken is one of these. The drunken clam is one. The news broadcast featuring Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons and their particular brand of oblivious local television professionalism is one. And of course, the cutaway gag is the most important of all the formal innovation that made the show unlike anything else on television when it arrived, and that has been both celebrated and criticized more than any other single aspect of its identity across the decades of its run. The giant chicken, officially named Ernie, a name the show deploys sparingly, was introduced in the second season in the episode Da Boom, which aired in December of 1999. The premise was simple. Ernie the giant chicken gave Peter an expired coupon, and Peter, outraged by this slight, got into a fight with the chicken that rapidly escalated into an elaborate, extended, physically spectacular brawl that destroyed everything in its path. The fight lasted several minutes. It was animated with a care and physical specificity that exceeded what the show typically applied to its action sequences. Buildings were damaged. Vehicles were destroyed. Characters fell from heights that would have been fatal in any realistic context and resumed fighting without pause. And at the end of it, Ernie apparently died. He came back in subsequent seasons for additional fights. Each new fight was longer than the last, more elaborate, more destructive, staged across more varied and improbable environments. The fights became one of the show's most anticipated recurring elements. The audience came to understand that when Ernie appeared, an extended action sequence was coming, and this knowledge was itself part of the comedy. The anticipation of the fight was part of the joke. What made the giant chicken fights work was that they were committed to in a way that most of the show's comedy was not. Family Guy's humor typically operated at the level of wit, quick, verbal, structured around setup and punchline. The giant chicken fights were physical, sustained, action-oriented, and entirely removed from verbal comedy. They were influenced more by Jackie Chan films and John Woo action sequences than by anything in the conventional adult animated comedy tradition. The animators who worked on them brought a different kind of energy to the sequences, treating the fights with the kind of serious technical attention that action directors bring to stunt choreography. The result was something that genuinely did not feel like it belonged in the same program as the cutaway gags and family conversations that surrounded it. And this incongruity of fully realized action film sequence buried inside a domestic animated sitcom was itself funnier than any specific joke within the fights. The cutaway gag is the show's most discussed formal feature, and it deserves a more careful and complete treatment than it usually receives in discussions of the show's quality and decline. In its early seasons, the cutaway worked on at least 3 distinct levels simultaneously. There was the surface level, the joke itself, the specific comedic content of whatever the cutaway depicted. There was the structural level, the way the cutaway connected to the line of dialogue that set it up, with a specific quality of relationship between setup and punchline that distinguished a good cutaway from a mechanical one. And there was the rhythmic level, the timing of the cutaway within the larger episode, the way it accelerated or redirected the energy of the scene it interrupted, and the quality of the transition back into the main story. In the best early cutaways, all 3 of these levels were working at the same time. The joke was specific, not a generic funny image, but something precisely constructed to illuminate or complicate or comment on the exact sentence that set it up. The structural relationship between setup and payoff was tight. The connection was not random, but felt inevitable in retrospect, as though the cutaway could not possibly have gone anywhere else. And the rhythmic function was elegant. The cutaway took exactly as long as it needed to take, delivered its comedy, and returned the episode to its main narrative without having disrupted the momentum of the scene. MacFarlane's own account of what made the early cutaways work was characteristically practical. He said that the gag had to be something you could justify intellectually if you were called on the carpet for it. You needed to be able to say what point you were making. This standard was not always met, not even in the early seasons. But the aspiration toward it shaped the writing in ways that were visible in the difference between gags that felt thought through and gags that felt thrown in because something needed to be there. The decline of the cutaway as a comedic instrument was not a sudden transformation. It was gradual. In the 4th season, the gags became slightly more frequent. In the 5th season, slightly longer on average. By the 7th and 8th seasons, the frequency and duration had changed enough that critics began to note what had happened, but even by then, the change was incremental enough that any single episode could be defended as not dramatically different from what came before. Only the cumulative view, looking at the arc of seasons rather than individual episodes, made the change visible in its full magnitude. South Park's 2006 critique, which depicted the Family Guy writing staff as manatees randomly selecting beach balls to generate jokes, was effective as a satirical attack because it targeted something real. The strongest version of the critique was not that Family Guy's cutaways were always random and disconnected, but that the show had lost the editorial standard that had originally distinguished the good cutaways from the mechanical ones. When MacFarlane was in the room actively participating in the selection of gags, the room had a specific sense of what he would find funny and what he would reject. When that presence was removed, the room continued producing gags at the same volume but without the same filtering mechanism. The result, over time, was a higher proportion of gags that felt more arbitrary, not because the writers were less talented, but because the specific taste that had calibrated the system was no longer in the room. The Conway Twitty gag is the most extreme and most discussed example of the cutaway format's degeneration in the show's later years. Conway Twitty was a country music star who had a successful career from the 1950s through the 1980s, and the running gag involved the show cutting away from whatever was happening in the main story to an extended, unedited broadcast of Twitty performing one of his actual songs. The first appearance was genuinely surprising in a way that was funny. The total non sequitur of cutting from a Family Guy scene to a country singer's performance was unexpected enough that it got a laugh through sheer incongruity. By the second and third appearances, the surprise was gone, and the gag was simply the show admitting, openly and without apology, that it did not have enough material to fill the episode and was using real-world entertainment to bridge the gap. By the time the gag had appeared multiple times, it was not a joke at all. It was a confession. The show's awareness of its own cutaway dependency became, in the later seasons, a source of self-referential humor that some viewers found charming and others found emblematic of the problem. Episodes in which characters acknowledged that a cutaway was happening, or commented on the cutaway format from within the cutaway, or returned from a cutaway to find that the other characters had been patiently waiting in silence while it ran its course. These moments of meta-commentary demonstrated that the writers knew what critics had been saying about their technique. They were aware of the problem. The response was to make jokes about being aware of the problem rather than to address the problem. This is, as creative strategies go, a defensible choice. Self-awareness is a legitimate comedic mode, and a show that acknowledges its own structural weaknesses in a funny way is doing something more interesting than simply pretending the weaknesses do not exist. But self-awareness is not the same as correction. The show could be simultaneously funny about its cutaway problem and still have the cutaway problem. It could acknowledge in a meta joke that the Conway Twitty gag was lazy and still keep using the Conway Twitty gag. The awareness and the behavior were independent of each other. Section 14. The Drunken Clam, Spooner Street, and the World of the Show. One of the consistently underappreciated aspects of Family Guy's creative foundation is the specificity and internal consistency of the world the show created. The fictional town of Stool Bend, wait, wrong show. The Griffin family's town of Stoolford actually, the show's fictional Rhode Island setting was not simply a generic American suburb with a funny name attached to it. It had specific geography, specific recurring institutions, and a specific social ecology that made it feel like a real place with a history, even as the show treated that history with complete indifference to continuity from one episode to the next. Spooner Street, where the Griffins lived, was a specific address in a specific neighborhood with specific neighbors whose relationships to the Griffin family were developed with more consistency than the show is usually given credit for. Joe Swanson lived across the street and to one side. Glenn Quagmire lived across the street and to the other. Cleveland Brown lived nearby until he received his own spin-off series. These neighbors were not interchangeable background figures. Each of them had a specific relationship with Peter, a specific role in the social ecosystem of the street, and a specific way of functioning as a comedic counterpoint to Peter's particular brand of chaos. The Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his friends gathered, was the show's equivalent of the Cheers bar or the Central Perk coffee shop, the recurring social gathering place that grounded the male friendship dynamics of the show in a specific physical space with a specific atmosphere. The Clam had regulars, had a particular visual aesthetic, had the specific quality of a neighborhood bar that had not changed in 30 years and did not intend to change. The show used it consistently enough that it developed a kind of presence in the viewer's mind, independent of whatever was happening in any particular episode. When you saw the exterior of the drunken clam, you knew what was about to happen. You knew the configuration of bodies around the bar, the particular quality of conversation that would follow, the rhythm of the friendship dynamics that the space seemed to produce. James Woods Regional High School, where Meg and then Chris attended, was named after the actor as part of a long-running joke about James Woods's somewhat flexible relationship to his own dignity. The school's naming had never been explained in-universe, which was itself funny. There was an implicit suggestion that Woods had done something sufficiently embarrassing or self-promotional to get a Rhode Island high school named after him, and the details were probably best left to the imagination. The school had its own recurring students and teachers and social hierarchies, most of them defined by their relationship to Meg's social struggles. The Griffin House itself was one of American animated television's more detailed domestic interiors. Each room had a specific character: the kitchen, where Lois spent much of her time, the living room with its specific furniture arrangement, and the television that was always visible, Peter's study that occasionally yielded comedic discoveries, Stewie's room, which housed, in its earlier seasons, an improbable collection of weapons and machines. The house's geography was maintained with surprising consistency across the early seasons. Viewers who paid attention to spatial relationships could track which door led to which room, which window looked out onto Spooner Street, where the stairs went. The consistency reinforced the sense that this was a real place with real physical properties rather than an arrangement of backgrounds used to frame dialogue. The broader geography of the Griffin's town was filled in gradually. Across the show's run, the Providence and Rhode Island references that grounded the fictional town in a real regional context, the specific stores and restaurants and civic buildings that gave the town a texture beyond just the Griffin House and the drunken clam. The show clearly did some research about Rhode Island and enjoyed using the regional specificity as a source of comedy, though the comedy rarely required that the audience have any knowledge of actual Rhode Island to access it. What the world-building of Family Guy achieved in its early seasons was something that is harder to describe than to experience. It made the fictional universe feel like it had been there before the show started and would continue after it ended. The town was not a backdrop. It was a place with a history and a character. The Griffin family was not a collection of archetypes. They were a specific family with specific relationships to specific neighbors in a specific town. This specificity created the conditions for comedy that felt grounded, rather than abstract jokes that derived their energy from character and context, rather than from pure randomness. The loss of this specificity in later seasons was gradual but real. The town, in its later incarnations, became more of a generic setting for whatever comedic premise the episode required than a consistent place with internal rules and history. Characters behaved differently from week to week in ways that the earlier seasons had taken care to avoid. The Griffins' relationships with their neighbors became thinner and more instrumental, defined by whatever the episode's plot needed, rather than by the accumulated history of living next to each other for years. Section 15. The show's relationship with celebrity and culture. Family Guy's use of real cultural references, real public figures, and real events as comedic material is so pervasive and so fundamental to its identity that it is easy to take for granted. But the specific way the show engaged with celebrity and culture, the particular rules, explicit and implicit, that governed how far it would go and in what directions is worth examining carefully, because it tells us something about the show's philosophy and about how that philosophy changed over time. In the early seasons, the show's cultural references served a specific function. They used shared cultural knowledge to create comedy that the audience experienced as recognition. When the show cut away to a specific scene involving a specific cultural figure, the comedy derived partly from the absurdity of the scene itself and partly from the accuracy of the observation about whoever was being referenced. The best early cultural references were both funny as situations and accurate as characterizations. The joke worked on the surface and underneath it simultaneously. The show's recurring use of James Woods as a recurring character, a version of James Woods playing himself, or rather playing an exaggerated version of himself that highlighted specific aspects of his public persona, was one of the cleaner examples of how celebrity engagement worked at its best. The comedy of James Woods in Family Guy was never simple mockery. It was a comedic portrait of a type, the Hollywood actor with a reputation for being difficult, for claiming intellectual seriousness while simultaneously being willing to take any role that was offered, for the gap between the gravity of his self-presentation and the reality of his career choices. The Family Guy version of James Woods was an extremely specific caricature that worked because it was based on observation of something real rather than constructed from nothing. The candy trail joke, Peter capturing James Woods by laying a trail of candy and waiting for Woods to follow it step by step, worked because it built on the established characterization. It was not a random attack. It was a comedic elaboration of a portrait that had already been established across multiple episodes. The audience laughed not just at the joke, but at the recognition of what the joke was saying about this specific fictional real person. The show's relationship with actual music was handled with similar care in its better years. When the show incorporated real songs into its comedy, it typically did so in ways that treated the music with enough respect to make the use funny rather than dismissive. The Conway-Twitty exception, where the comedy derived precisely from the disrespect of using real country music performances as filler, was, in the context of the show's usual relationship with music, genuinely surprising the first time. The show that had produced elaborate original musical numbers, that had written love songs and holiday anthems and full theatrical productions, was suddenly using real music as a lazy alternative to writing its own. The surprise was the joke. The problem was the repetition. The show's treatment of real political figures changed significantly across its run. In the early seasons, political humor was integrated into the show's overall satirical approach in a way that felt relatively balanced. The jokes landed on the absurdities of the political process rather than simply on the awfulness of one party or the other. The show had always had a liberal bias, which was consistent with MacFarlane's own politics, but the early seasons wore this lightly enough that the comedy was accessible to viewers who did not share those politics. As the show progressed, particularly after the 2004 election and through the Bush years and beyond, the political content became heavier and more explicitly partisan. Brian Griffin, who had always been somewhat liberal in his opinions, became increasingly a vehicle for the writer's political commentary, delivering speeches and monologues that were less character dialogue and more editorial content embedded in a fictional frame. The comedy increasingly relied on the audience's agreement with the political position being expressed rather than on the independent comic value of the expression. Viewers who agreed found this engaging or satisfying. Viewers who disagreed found it preachy, and even some viewers who agreed found it preachy. The show's cultural references in its later seasons became broader and less specific in a way that mirrored the general decline in the precision of its humor. Early references assumed a shared cultural knowledge that the audience either had or did not have, and made jokes that were equally funny whether or not you got the reference, though they were funnier if you did. Later references increasingly relied on the recognition itself as the comedy. It was funny because you recognized it, and the recognition was the entire joke rather than the entry point to a more complex joke. This shift from reference as context to reference as punchline reflected a broader movement in the show's comedy from density to volume. Section 16, The Showrunners, The Writer's Revolution, and How the Room Changed. The history of who was actually running Family Guy day to day across its long broadcast history is more complicated than the public narrative suggests. MacFarlane's role as creator and executive producer was always official and consistent, but the people doing the actual work of running the show, making the daily decisions about story direction, writer management, network relationships, and creative standards changed multiple times across the show's history, and each change left marks on the program. David Zuckerman, who had co-developed the series with MacFarlane from its earliest stages, served as the original showrunner and executive producer through the show's first canceled run. Zuckerman was responsible for establishing the foundational structure of the show, the character dynamics, the tonal balance between comedy and warmth, the specific ways in which the family's relationships were dramatized. His departure after the cancellation meant that the creative architecture he had helped build needed to be maintained by other hands when the show came back. Chris Sheridan held the executive producer role through much of the post-revival period, and his presence as a bridge between the original run and the revival gave the returning show some institutional continuity. He had been in the room during the show's best years and understood what the show was supposed to be trying to do. But the challenge facing him and the rest of the revival team was fundamental. They were trying to reconstitute a creative ecosystem that had been built through years of specific collaboration and that could not simply be rebuilt by reassembling its components. Rich Appel joined the show in 2005 and became one of its most long-serving executive producers, eventually co-showrunning alongside Alex Sulkin. Both men were present in the writer's room during the years when MacFarlane was still actively participating, and both accumulated the internal library of MacFarlane's sensibility that Sulkin described as the single most important thing he got from his years on the show. When they later co-show-ran the series after MacFarlane's departure from active writing, they were working from that library, doing their best to make decisions consistent with the specific taste and vision that had built the show. The challenge of this position is inherent to showrunning a franchise that the creator has stepped back from. You are not making your show. You are making someone else's show, filtered through your understanding of their intentions. The better your understanding, the closer your result will be to what the creator would have done. But understanding someone's vision is always approximation, and approximation accumulates error over time. Small decisions that would have gone one way with the creator in the room go differently without them. The differences are individually invisible, but collectively transform the show. Alex Sulkin has spoken in interviews with unusual candor about what this meant for Family Guy's later seasons. He acknowledged that the room without MacFarlane was a different place, not worse in terms of talent, but different in the specific way that a room feels different when its most influential voice is absent. The room was a nicer place by the time of recent seasons. He said people were less competitive, the atmosphere was warmer and more collaborative. But the niceness was, in some ways, a symptom of the departure of the competitive energy that had driven the show to its best work. MacFarlane's presence in the room had pushed writers to compete for his attention and approval in ways that were uncomfortable but productive. His absence made the room more comfortable and somewhat less demanding. The addition of more women to the writing staff in the show's later seasons has been cited by several observers as one of the factors behind the moderation of the show's treatment of Meg Griffin in those years. The writing staff through much of the show's middle period was heavily male, and the specific quality of the humor directed at Meg, her appearance, her desirability, her status as an object of contempt within her own family, reflected sensibilities that were more comfortable in an all-male room than they would have been in a more diverse one. As the room became more diverse, the Meg abuse decreased. This correlation is not conclusive proof of causation, but it is suggestive of the way that room demographics shape creative output in ways that individual writers might not notice from inside the process. The 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike was a significant disruption to the show's creative process during one of its most important transitional periods. MacFarlane was an active supporter of the strike, walking the picket line and publicly advocating for the writers' positions. Fox, during the strike, made the decision to air 3 previously completed Family Guy episodes without MacFarlane's permission. The episodes had been delivered and paid for before the strike began, so Fox was legally within its rights to broadcast them. But airing episodes against the wishes of the show's creator created a tension between the network and MacFarlane that persisted well beyond the strike's resolution. MacFarlane's post-strike relationship with Fox was characterized by a level of underlying mistrust that had not existed before the strike, and this mistrust colored the show's institutional environment for years afterward. The 2023 Writers Guild of America strike caused additional disruption, delaying Season 23's premiere until February 2025 and complicating the production process for several episodes. MacFarlane was again publicly supportive of the strike, and the showrunners likewise declined to work during the work stoppage. The resulting production delays meant that the season's episode count was reduced, and the timeline compressed in ways that put additional pressure on the creative process. Section 17. The Simpsons, the Comparisons, and the Question of Originality. Family Guy's relationship with The Simpsons is one of the most enduring and occasionally contentious discussions in American animated comedy. The two shows share a format adult animated comedy about a nuclear family in a fictional American town, aired on Fox on Sunday nights, structured around a combination of domestic comedy and broader social satire. They have been compared to each other since Family Guy's premiere and will continue to be compared to each other for as long as both exist, which appears to be indefinitely. The comparison is sometimes useful and sometimes misleading, and understanding when it is which requires paying attention to what the shows are actually doing rather than to their surface similarities. The Simpsons premiered in 1989. By the time Family Guy arrived in 1999, The Simpsons had been on the air for a decade and had established itself as the defining work of adult animated comedy. Its characters were cultural institutions. Its satirical approach had been analyzed and written about extensively. It had won countless awards and generated enormous commercial success. Comparing Family Guy to The Simpsons was inevitable in a way that was also, from the outset, somewhat unfair. The Simpsons had 10 years of cultural weight behind it and a creative peak in its 3rd through 8th seasons that represented some of the finest television comedy ever produced. Comparing a debut season to a mature classic is not a neutral critical act. The shows shared influences more than they shared direct creative lineage. Both drew on the tradition of American domestic comedy that ran from radio, through early television, through All in the Family, and the Norman Lear programs of the 1970s. Both were working in a medium that The Simpsons had already established as capable of serious satirical work. Both had a working-class father at their center who was more lovable than competent, a patient mother who held the family together, and children who served as specific comedic functions within the family system. What Family Guy was doing differently was the cutaway structure and the specific quality of its absurdism. The Simpsons, at its best, achieved its comedy through the internal logic of its own universe, through consistent characters making choices that were funny because they were exactly what those characters would do. Family Guy's comedy was more disruptive. It interrupted its own narrative to insert unrelated content. It allowed its humor to move in directions that the story did not require and did not lead to. It treated the boundary between the fictional world and the real cultural world as permeable and exploitable. These were different methods, not hierarchically ranked, and the comparison of the two shows has been most useful when it paid attention to what each method could and could not do rather than simply asking which method was better. The Simpsons writers' room over the years responded to Family Guy with a combination of professional irritation and, in at least some accounts, genuine admiration for the show's commercial success and fan following. The flowers sent to South Park after the Cartoon Wars episode reflected a frustration with Family Guy's success that was probably as much about competition as about artistic principles. The later crossover episode in 2014, in which the two families literally met and interacted, was an acknowledgement that the comparison was too persistent to ignore, and that dealing with it directly, however awkwardly, the crossover episode handled it was preferable to continued parallel existence without acknowledgement. MacFarlane's own relationship to The Simpsons was complicated by admiration. He had watched The Simpsons as a teenager and credited it with changing his understanding of what animation could be. But he had built a different show, and the insistence on comparing the two often elided the genuine differences between them. He said in one interview that he was not trying to make The Simpsons. He was trying to make Family Guy. The distinction mattered to him. The rivalry between the shows, real and imagined, was one of the cultural backgrounds against which both programs operated for years. The Simpsons featured a version of Peter Griffin in its own universe, wanted for plagiarism. Family Guy featured Homer Simpson as a guest character. The back and forth between the two shows played out partly in the episodes themselves and partly in the press and in the wider cultural conversation around adult animation, was the kind of productive creative friction that shapes the entire category by forcing both parties to consider what they were doing and why they were doing it differently from each other. The question of Family Guy's originality, whether it was sufficiently different from The Simpsons to justify its existence as a separate creative project, or whether it was simply The Simpsons with the cutaway format bolted on, was debated extensively throughout the show's early years and less extensively as time passed and the shows diverged more clearly. The answer, from this historical distance, is that Family Guy was genuinely original in specific ways that had nothing to do with The Simpsons. The cutaway format, the specific quality of MacFarlane's comedic voice, the particular blend of pop culture satire and genuine warmth that characterized the first 3 seasons, and the specific characters, especially Stewie, who had no meaningful Simpsons equivalent. The comparison was always somewhat reductive, and the show's legacy is clearest when it is evaluated on its own terms. Section 18. What the show got right when it got it right. The final reckoning of Family Guy's legacy should not end with a catalog of its failures, because the failures, real and significant as they were, do not tell the whole story. The whole story includes the episodes that achieved something genuinely extraordinary, that produced moments of comedy or emotion or insight that no other program on television could have produced, that made the case for what animated adult comedy could be when it was made by people who cared about making it great. The Brian and Stewie episode from Season 8, the one in which the two characters spend an entire episode locked in a bank vault, talking is the clearest and most frequently cited example. The episode had no cutaways. It had no supporting cast. It had no plot outside of the conversation itself. It was, for a show that had built its identity on the opposite of this, on density of jokes, on supplementary gags, on the restless movement between the main story and disconnected comedy, an almost shocking act of formal restraint. And it worked better than almost anything else the show had produced in years, because it trusted the audience to stay with two characters who were genuinely interesting and genuinely interesting to each other. Brian's revelation in that episode that he kept a gun in a safety deposit box and had, at various points in his life, considered using it on himself was a piece of writing that would have been remarkable in any format. In the context of Family Guy, a show that had generally treated emotional darkness as something to be acknowledged quickly and then laughed away, it was extraordinary. The show stayed with it. Brian said it, and then Stewie responded to it, and the response was not a joke. It was a declaration of love, specific, direct, completely sincere, that changed the emotional temperature of the episode from comedy to something much harder to categorize. The final moments of the episode, in which Stewie told Brian that if Brian ever chose to use that gun, Stewie would be right behind him, was one of the most quietly devastating things the show ever produced. Devastating not because of what it said about death, but because of what it said about the depth of the friendship between two characters who had, in their better seasons, been the show's most reliably entertaining double act. The Road to the Multiverse episode achieved a different kind of greatness, the kind that comes from formal ambition and creative confidence rather than emotional depth. The premise of traveling between parallel universes rendered in different animation styles was an idea that could have been executed as a simple collection of parodies and been perfectly enjoyable. The show went further, using the multiverse structure to say something real about the relationship between style and meaning the way the Disney-style universe, rendered with the warmth and beauty of classic animation, produced a world that felt more comfortable than the real one and that its inhabitants were reluctant to leave. The episode was smart in the way that the show's best work was always smart, not just clever, but genuinely engaged with an idea beyond its comedic potential. The episode Stewie Kills Lois and its sequel Lois Kills Stewie from Season 6 were among the most ambitious things the show attempted in its post-revival years. By committing to a genuine story across 2 episodes, by allowing real-seeming consequences to unfold without the usual reset button, and by depicting Stewie finally achieving the thing he had been plotting since the first episode, killing Lois and becoming the dictator of the world, the show honored the character and the premise that had made it compelling. In the first place, the two-parter was exciting, dramatically satisfying, and genuinely funny in ways that the show had not been consistently for several seasons. That it ended with the revelation that the events had all been a simulation in Stewie's computer rather than real events in the show's universe was a choice that many fans found frustrating, a retreat from the consequences. The story had earned, but even the resolution could not fully undo what the 2 episodes had achieved. The musical numbers, as this script has already discussed at length, represented a consistent source of genuine artistic achievement across the show's entire history. From Road to Rhode Island through Christmas Time is Killing Us through the Disney sequence in Road to the Multiverse, the show produced musical comedy of real quality and ambition that had few equivalents in animated television. The commitment to the musical numbers, the production values, the time spent on arrangement and performance was itself a statement about what the show believed it was capable of. And then there are the thousands of individual jokes spread across hundreds of episodes that were simply brilliant in the concentrated way that great comedy is brilliant. The gags that worked because they were precisely true about something. The cutaways that were funny not because they were random, but because they revealed something real about the character whose line had set them up. The dialogue exchanges between Brian and Stewie, particularly in the Road to episodes, that achieved a kind of naturalistic comedic rhythm. The timing of people who have been having conversations with each other for a long time and understand exactly how the other thinks. These moments are still there, still available, still funny, evidence of the intelligence and craft that went into the show at its best. Family Guy, in the final analysis, was a show that did extraordinary things when it was extraordinary and ordinary things when it was ordinary, and had the particular misfortune of being evaluated primarily on the basis of what it was at its worst, rather than what it was at its best. The worst was real, but so was the best. And the best was genuinely great, original, and funny, and warm, and brave, and technically accomplished in ways that earned every award, and every nomination, and every moment of the enormous cultural attention that the show received. Across its long history, the boy from Kent drew something alive. Sometimes the thing he drew was ordinary, sometimes it was brilliant. The ordinary is forgettable. The brilliant remains, and it will remain, and it is worth going back to find it. If you're still with me right now, all the way through to the end of this, thank you for spending this time. Whether you made it through in one sitting or came back across a few nights or found your way here completely by accident and just let it play, you found something worth finding. The story of Family Guy is the story of what it means to make something real in a world that mostly wants you to make something profitable, and the gap between those two things is where the most interesting creative struggles always happen. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't. Leave a comment. Tell me what part of this surprised you the most, and come back next time. Sleep well. End of script. Section 19. The voice sessions. What happened in the recording booth? The voice recording sessions for Family Guy were, by all accounts from people who participated in them, considerably more lively and unpredictable than the typical professional voice recording session. MacFarlane recording 4 major characters in a single session was inherently unusual, but the unusual nature of that arrangement had secondary effects on the entire culture of the recording studio environment that shaped how the finished episodes sounded. The logistical reality of MacFarlane recording Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire meant that scenes involving multiple MacFarlane-voiced characters required particular attention from the director and the recording staff. When Peter and Brian were in a scene together, MacFarlane was essentially having a conversation with himself, performing one side, then the other, then editing the performances together in post-production to create the impression of dialogue. This required him to hold both characters in his head simultaneously, to know how Brian would respond before he recorded Peter's line, so that the timing of Peter's delivery would leave the right amount of space for Brian's reply. The technical discipline required to do this consistently across hundreds of episodes and thousands of scenes was real. The approach also had creative benefits that went beyond technical accomplishment. Because MacFarlane was simultaneously the voice of both characters in a 2-character exchange, he had an unusually direct connection to the rhythm and dynamic of the dialogue. He could feel where a line was landing too fast or too slow, where the comic timing needed adjustment, where an extra beat of silence would serve the scene better than the one written in the script. The control this gave him over the comedic timing of scenes involving his characters was one of the specific advantages the show had that other programs could not easily replicate. The voice actors' interactions with each other in the recording booth were another source of the show's energy. Although the technical requirements of animation meant that actors often recorded their lines separately rather than together, it is easier to separate clean audio tracks to animation than to deal with the bleed and room ambiance of group recording. Family Guy brought its cast together for at least some sessions, particularly for scenes that required real reactive energy. Alex Borstein and MacFarlane recording Lois and Peter scenes together produced a different quality of performance than either could produce alone, because the presence of another actor responding in real time to what you are doing changes what you do. Seth Green's work as Chris, particularly in scenes involving extended monologues or emotional moments, required him to maintain the Buffalo Bill register across performance lengths that challenged the physical sustainability of the voice. He has described in interviews the specific throat management required to keep the voice consistent over the course of a long recording session, the way certain aspects of the performance created physical fatigue that he needed to pace against, building in moments of rest without losing the character's essential quality. Green's experience across multiple animated productions and his own series Robot Chicken gave him the technical awareness to manage this kind of sustained performance, but it remained genuinely demanding work. Mila Kunis's experience recording Meg evolved significantly across the show's long run. In the early seasons, Meg was a supporting character with modest screen time and relatively straightforward emotional content. As the show progressed and Meg's treatment became more extreme, her scenes requiring her to perform progressively more intense reactions to progressively more severe abuse. The recording demands on Kunis changed accordingly. Performing distress convincingly in voice work requires specific technical skills that are different from performing distress in a physical performance, because without a body, everything depends on the voice alone. Kunis navigated this with what the show's directors described as consistent craft, finding the emotional register for each scene without allowing the recording sessions to become a purely mechanical exercise. Patrick Warburton's recording sessions for Joe Swanson were notable for the physical presence the actor brought to a voice performance, something that seems paradoxical but makes more sense when you understand that Warburton performs physically even when only a microphone is recording him. He stands in the booth, he moves, he gestures. The physical commitment of the performance generates energy that the voice alone could not produce, and the people who have watched him record have uniformly described it as an experience of watching a full performance rather than simply hearing a voice being captured. This investment is audible in the finished work. The show's guest casting across its run produced recording sessions with an extraordinary range of performers. The guest list for Family Guy across its history includes senators and cabinet members, rock musicians and classical composers, film stars from multiple generations, athletes, journalists, authors, and an assortment of celebrities whose connection to the specific episode in which they appeared ranged from artistically motivated to entirely commercial. Each guest brought their own relationship to the voice recording format, and the quality of guest performances varied accordingly. The best guest appearances were ones where the celebrity was playing a heightened version of themselves in a way that was funny because the heightening was accurate, where the caricature told a specific truth about the actual person. The weakest were ones where the celebrity simply read lines that could have been delivered by any voice actor, their presence contributing nothing beyond their name in the episode credits. The recording of Family Guy's musical numbers required a different process from the standard episode recording. The voice actors worked with the show's musical team to learn their parts, rehearse the arrangements, and develop performance versions of the songs that worked in the animated context. For the Road to episodes especially, where the musical numbers were elaborate and central rather than supplementary, the recording sessions involved multiple passes at each song, working through the specific timing and vocal interaction that the animation would eventually be built around. MacFarlane's musical training was most directly relevant in these sessions. His ability to perform complex musical material while maintaining character voices was a specific skill that made the show's musical ambitions achievable in practice rather than just theoretically possible. Section 20. What remains and why it matters. Every cultural artifact of sufficient age and influence eventually faces the question of what it was actually for, what it contributed to the world beyond its immediate entertainment value, what it changed or shifted or opened up, what it left behind when it had passed through the culture's active attention and settled into the archive. Family Guy, as of this writing, has not passed into the archive. It is still being made, new episodes are still being produced and broadcast and streamed. Seth MacFarlane is still voicing Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. Alex Borstein is still Lois. Mila Kunis is still Meg. The show that premiered after Super Bowl 33 in January of 1999 is still, in some definitional sense, the same program. But what it contributed to the world is already clear enough to assess. It expanded the range of what American network television was willing to broadcast in the primetime animated comedy format. The Parents Television Council's consistent complaints against the show, and the FCC's consistent refusal to act on those complaints, established a series of precedents about the limits of broadcast content regulation in the context of comedy. The show pushed at those limits in specific ways and found, repeatedly, that the limits were further away than the most conservative institutional voices wanted them to be. This gave subsequent shows a more clearly defined operating range. It demonstrated that the adult animated format could sustain genuine emotional depth. The Brian and Stewie episode was discussed in the television industry not just as a good episode of Family Guy, but as evidence about what animated comedy was capable of, that characters who had been built primarily for comedy purposes could, when the writing demanded it, carried genuine emotional weight. This demonstration had effects on how subsequent animators and writers thought about the format's possibilities. It pioneered a specific approach to internet virality before internet virality was a recognized phenomenon. The cutaway gag format, which produced easily isolatable comedic sequences, turned out to be ideally suited for the clip-sharing culture that emerged with YouTube and its successors. Family Guy was not the first show to have its moments shared online, but it was one of the first to have its format shaped, at least in part, by the logic of clip sharing. The lesson that isolated funny moments could build cultural presence that complete episodes could not was one that the broader entertainment industry learned partly from watching how Family Guy spread through the early internet. It contributed to the normalization of adult animated comedy as a viable commercial and artistic category. The Simpsons had already established this category, but the space it occupied was somewhat singular. The Simpsons was The Simpsons, not a proof of concept for an entire genre. Family Guy's success, alongside South Park and eventually dozens of subsequent programs, helped turn adult animated comedy from an exceptional achievement into an established format with its own economics, its own audience expectations, and its own creative traditions. And it created specific characters and specific moments that have become permanent parts of American pop culture. Stewie Griffin's voice is recognizable to people who have never watched a complete episode of the show. Peter Griffin's specific blend of incompetence and sincerity is a recognizable comic archetype that has been referenced and imitated in countless subsequent works. Brian Griffin, at his best thoughtful, dry, genuine, aware of his own limitations, is one of the more complete portraits of a specific kind of aspirational intellectual that American comedy has produced. These are real cultural contributions that persist beyond the specific context of the episodes in which they were created. The show also created a body of documentary evidence about itself. Its behind-the-scenes stories, its controversies, its production history, its casting near misses, its Easter eggs and running gags and meta-references, all of this constitutes a secondary layer of cultural production that exists alongside the primary text of the episodes themselves. The story of Family Guy is, in many ways, as interesting as Family Guy. The Connecticut child who drew at 2 years old, the Rhode Island thesis film, the Fox deal at 24, the 2 cancellations, the DVD resurrection, the Super Bowl slot, the 9/11 near miss. All of it is the specific human story behind the cultural artifact, and the richness of that story is itself a measure of what the artifact meant to the people who made it and the people who watched it. What the show leaves behind, when all of it is finally over, is not simply a catalog of episodes ranked by quality from best to worst. It leaves behind the first 3 seasons, which were genuinely great by any measure and which will be watched and enjoyed and learned from by people who care about animated comedy for as long as animated comedy is a living format. It leaves behind a collection of the best individual episodes from its revival years, which demonstrated in specific and compelling ways what the show could still do when it committed to doing something real. It leaves behind a model of what not to do, the specific ways in which a show can lose its identity through accumulated small decisions, for the education of anyone willing to look carefully at the record. And it leaves behind the story of the man who drew it and the people who helped him bring it to life, which is the most interesting part of all. The drawing was alive once. Sometimes it was alive for longer stretches than others. The stretches when it was most alive were among the most alive things that American television produced in that format, in that era, for those millions of people who found them and were glad they did. That is enough. That is, in fact, quite a lot. Section 21. The supporting world characters who shaped the show from the edges. Every successful ensemble show produces, over time, a secondary layer of characters whose importance to the show's identity is disproportionate to their screen time. In Family Guy, this secondary layer was populated by figures who worked as specific comedic tools, while also gradually accumulating enough history and consistency to feel like genuine presences in the Griffin family's world. Cleveland Brown, one of Peter's core group of bar friends, was a character defined by his specific brand of calm. In a show populated by characters who responded to everything with volume and excess, Cleveland responded to almost everything with a measured, deliberate patience that made him funny by contrast. His voice slow, careful, proceeding through its sentences as though checking each word for structural soundness before committing to it, was the perfect counterpoint to Peter's declamatory enthusiasm. His patience with Peter's behavior, which would have been incomprehensible in a realistic context, read as both funny and faintly moving in the context of the show's logic. These were friends who had been friends long enough that extraordinary tolerance had become ordinary. Cleveland's departure from Family Guy to anchor his own spin-off series, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013, was one of the decisions from the post-revival era that divided the show's audience. Removing one of the four members of Peter's core friend group changed the dynamic of the drunken clam scenes in ways that were subtle but real. The specific combination of Peter, Cleveland, Quagmire, and Joe had worked as a social ecosystem where each personality served as a counterweight to the others. With Cleveland gone, that ecosystem was unbalanced, and the replacement characters never quite filled the specific gap he had occupied. Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, was one of the show's most consistently underutilized characters across its entire run. She spent 7 seasons pregnant in a way that started as a background joke and eventually became a kind of accidental commentary on the show's approach to female characters in the early years present, patient, defined almost entirely by her relationship to a male character, and not particularly expected to have her own story. When the baby finally arrived, the show made some attempts to develop Bonnie as a more independent character, with varying degrees of success. Tom Tucker, the vain and self-important local news anchor, and Diane Simmons, his co-anchor, were a recurring comedy pair who satirized the specific culture of local television news. The peculiar combination of manufactured authority and trivial concern, the competitive personal relationships barely concealed beneath the professional presentation. The gap between the gravity with which local news presented itself and the actual importance of most local news. Both characters were performed with enough consistency to have developed genuine comedic identities over the years. Mort Goldman, the pharmacist and family friend, and his son Neil, who had a persistent, unrequited crush on Meg, filled specific comedic functions in the show's ecosystem. Neil's pursuit of Meg across multiple seasons was handled with varying levels of sensitivity. The show used the dynamic sometimes to illuminate Meg's social situation from a different angle, and sometimes simply as a source of easy laughs at Neil's expense. The character's persistence and genuine, if misguided, emotional investment in Meg were funnier in the early seasons than in later ones, where the comedy became more mechanical. The Mayor Adam West character, a version of the Batman actor playing a strange, slightly unhinged version of himself as the mayor of the Griffin's town, was one of the show's most cheerfully absurd recurring figures. West's willingness to parody himself with complete commitment gave the character a quality that a conventionally performed comedic mayor would not have had. West himself seemed genuinely delighted by the absurdity of the characterization, and that delight communicated itself in the performance in ways that made even the show's weakest Adam West jokes funnier than they deserved to be. West's death in 2017 ended the character's appearances and was treated within the show as a genuine loss, an unusual acknowledgement of grief in a program that did not typically allow for straightforward emotional responses to real-world events. Herbert, the elderly man with his unsavory interest in Chris, was a character whose comedy was, from its first appearance, based on something that creates legitimate unease. The show consistently played Herbert's interest for laughs in ways that required the audience to register both the joke and the discomfort simultaneously, and the combination was handled with a specific tone that distinguished it from more directly harmful content, not by hiding what the joke was about, but by framing it in a way that acknowledged the wrongness while locating the comedy in the character's obliviousness to his own wrongness, rather than in the victimhood of anyone else. Whether this framing was sufficient, or whether the character's continued presence across many seasons normalized something that should not have been normalized, was a question the show's critics raised repeatedly and that the show never directly addressed. Section 22. The show's relationship with its own history. One of the stranger aspects of Family Guy's long run is the show's evolving relationship with its own history, the way it looked back at itself, referenced itself, commented on itself, and occasionally attempted to correct itself across the decades of its production. The Back to the Pilot episode, already discussed in the context of the show's Easter eggs, was the most explicit example of the show examining its own origin with a level of meta-commentary that few programs attempt. By sending Brian and Stewie back to the events of the first episode, the show placed its 2011 versions of those characters in direct contact with their 1999 versions, making visible the changes that 2 decades of storytelling had made to the characters. The 1999 Stewie was obviously different from the 2011 Stewie, more purely villainous, less emotionally complex, less explicitly interested in his friendship with Brian as the center of his emotional life. The episode acknowledged this without apologizing for it, treating the evolution as a fact about the show's history rather than as either an achievement or a failure. The show's fourth wall breaking became more frequent and more elaborate as the seasons progressed. Characters would acknowledge they were in a television show, reference the show's declining quality or controversial episodes or network relationships, discuss the writers directly, or speak to the audience in ways that explicitly removed the fictional frame. This technique has a long history in comedy. It is as old as commedia dell'arte and is used by everything from Mel Brooks films to contemporary streaming series, but Family Guy's version of it was specific to the show's particular situation, a program that had become conscious of its own length, of its audience's familiarity with its conventions, of the critiques that had accumulated against it over the years. The self-referential jokes about the show's own quality were, in their way, an honest engagement with the criticism. MacFarlane and the writers knew that critics found the show less good than it had been. They knew that fans drew comparisons to the early seasons that did not favor the later ones. Rather than ignoring this knowledge, they incorporated it into the show's humor, making jokes about the cutaway format, about the show's longevity, about specific things critics had said. Whether this acknowledged the problem or simply found a way to profit from acknowledging it without actually fixing it was the central critical question about the fourth wall breaking humor, and different viewers reached different conclusions about the answer. The show also accumulated, across its run, a practice of revisiting earlier episodes in ways that functioned as either celebration or revision of its own history. Episodes that returned to situations or characters from the first 3 seasons were implicitly acknowledging that those seasons represented a specific reference point, a baseline of what the show was supposed to be against, which later seasons were measured. The return was not always successful, but the impulse behind it was real, an attempt to reconnect with something that had been lost, or at least to acknowledge that the loss had happened. The anniversary episodes and milestone celebrations, the 100th episode, the 200th, the 300th, the 400th, and eventually the 450th were occasions for the show to position itself within its own history. These episodes were typically self-congratulatory, in ways that felt earned by the sheer improbability of the show's continued existence, but that also obscured the more complicated story of what the continued existence had cost in creative terms. Surviving is not the same as thriving. The show survived. Whether it thrived, across all the seasons of its existence, was a more complicated question that the anniversary celebrations predictably declined to address directly. The show will eventually end. The 4-season renewal through season 27 ensures that the end is not imminent, but it is visible on the horizon in a way that it was not for much of the show's history. When the final episode airs, when Peter, Lois, Meg, Chris, Stewie, and Brian appear on screen for the last time, in whatever form the writers choose to leave them in the show's relationship with its own history will be complete. Whether that final episode honors the history or simply ends it remains, for now, to be seen. What is already knowable is what the show was at its best. The best is documented. It is available. It does not require the final episode to confirm or deny it. The first 3 seasons exist, fully formed, waiting for anyone who wants to experience them. They will continue to exist and to be good long after the show has finally ended and the last discussion of whether it should have ended sooner has settled into the general consensus of cultural memory. The boy from Kent drew something alive. The living thing he drew continued to exist, through all the changes it underwent, long enough to become a part of the permanent record of what American television was in the first quarter of the 21st century. That is the legacy. That is, finally, enough. There is something worth sitting with before we close this out completely about what it actually means to grow up alongside a television show. Family Guy premiered in January of 1999. The people who were teenagers when it first aired are now well into their 30s and 40s. The kids who discovered it through Adult Swim reruns in 2003, staying up past midnight to catch it on Cartoon Network, are now adults with jobs and families and mortgages. A whole generation of people formed their sense of humor, at least in part, by watching Peter Griffin make terrible decisions in a fictional Rhode Island suburb. They quoted it at school. They argued about it online during the first decade of the internet's social phase. They defended it to parents who did not understand it and could not understand why their children found it funny. That relationship, the one between a viewer and a show they grew up with, is not easily replaced or replicated. It is a specific emotional bond that has almost nothing to do with the show's objective quality and almost everything to do with when in your life you encountered it. The episodes of Family Guy that hit you when you were 14 feel different from the episodes you watch at 34, and that is not because the episodes changed. It is because you changed. The show was the same. You were different. This is why the discourse around Family Guy so often generates more heat than light. People who encountered the show during its first 3 seasons experience a version of it that people who discovered it in season 13 simply do not have access to. Not because those later seasons are unavailable, but because the context in which you first watch something shapes every subsequent viewing of it in ways that are invisible but permanent. The people who loved the early show and feel the loss of it are not imagining the loss. They are responding to something real, the specific combination of the show itself and the moment in their own lives when they encountered it. That combination cannot be recovered, which is what makes the loss feel genuine rather than simply nostalgic. MacFarlane has said, in various interviews over the years, that he is aware of this dimension of the show's relationship to its audience. He knows that for a lot of people, Family Guy is not just a television program. It is a memory. It is a shorthand. It is the specific language of a particular time in their lives when the world felt a certain way, and this show fit that feeling. That kind of relationship with an audience is rare, and it is not something you can manufacture. It either happens or it does not. And when it does, it leaves an impression that outlasts the quality of any individual episode. The show that airs today is, objectively, a different show from the one that premiered in 1999. The characters are different, the humor is different, the ambitions are different, and the world it exists in is different. The internet has made the clip-sharing aspect of the show's comedy almost irrelevant because everything is already clipped and available at any moment. The cultural references that the show built its comedy around are now embedded in the culture so deeply that the references themselves feel dated inside jokes that everybody already knows. The shock value that once distinguished the show from its competitors has been diffused by a media landscape that has found ways to be more shocking than any primetime network program ever will be allowed to be. None of this means the show failed. It means the show lasted long enough to outlive the conditions that made it special. That is, in a strange way, a form of success. Most shows do not last long enough to have this problem. Most shows get canceled before they can change so much that their original fans feel alienated by what they have become. Family Guy lasted long enough to become something its earliest audience could not have predicted, and it will continue, through whatever seasons remain in its contract, until the last episode airs and the credits roll, and the Griffin family is, at last, still. What you carry away from it is your own. The things it made you laugh at, the things it made you think about, the lines you still remember 20 years after you first heard them, the characters who felt, for a while, like people you actually knew. That is yours. Nobody can take it from you, and it does not matter what the ratings are now, or what the critics said in season 18, or what the show became in the years after it was at its best. The drawing was alive. You saw it. That was real. Thanks for spending this time with me. If you found something in here that surprised you or that you want to talk about, drop a comment below. Tell me what your favorite piece of all of this was, or what you wish I had covered that I did not. Every comment genuinely helps this channel find the people who are looking for this kind of content. Subscribe if you have not. There is more of this coming. And until then, rest well.